Hello, and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. On a spring night in the year 1571, a woman whose name has not survived in any surviving record, a baker's wife living in the wooden outskirts of a city called Moscow, went to sleep believing the greatest danger her family faced was the ordinary danger every family in that city faced every single spring. The danger of a cough turning into something worse before the cold finally broke. She did not know, because there was no way for her to know, that somewhere south of her own city, moving north across the open steppe with a speed no Muscovite scout had managed to outrun and no Muscovite garrison had managed to intercept, a mounted army of Crimean Tatars was riding toward her, led by a Khan named Devlet I Jure, a vassal in every formal sense to the distant and enormously powerful Sultan who ruled from Constantinople, and that within a matter of days the wooden city she'd fallen asleep inside would be burning so completely, so nearly totally, that foreign observers who arrived afterwards struggled to find language large enough to describe what they were looking at. Estimates of how many people died in that single fire, in that single week, in that one city, still vary wildly across the surviving sources, from tens of thousands to figures considerably higher than that, and this account will not pretend to give you a precision no honest historian actually possesses, but it will tell you plainly what is not in dispute, that in the spring of 1571, the city that would one day call itself the capital of an empire stretching across 11 time zones was burned nearly to the ground by an army acting, formally and by treaty, in the name of the Ottoman Sultan, and that almost nobody living inside that burning city that week could have imagined, even for a moment, that the balance of power they were currently drowning in would ever run the other way. Picture her, if you will, in the last ordinary hour she had before that certainty arrived, moving through whatever small tasks made up the end of her own day, banking the coals in her own hearth, checking on a child already asleep in the next room, latching a door that would do nothing at all against what was coming, entirely unaware that she was living inside the very last undisturbed evening a great many of her own neighbours would ever know. This account cannot tell you her name, because no surviving record kept it, and it cannot tell you whether she survived the week that followed, or became one of the tens of thousands who did not, and it offers her to you honestly, as exactly what she actually is. Not a verified historical figure, but a plausible, composite stand-in for the tens of thousands of ordinary Muscovites who lived through that single terrible week with no name of their own left behind in any surviving chronicle. A silence this whole long night is going to keep asking you to notice, again and again, standing just behind every single treaty and every single battle this account is about to walk you through. That is the thesis this whole long night is going to try to earn, stated plainly here at the very start the way this channel likes to do it. Russia and the Ottoman Empire did not begin as equals circling one another warily, and they did not begin as enemies at all in any way either side would have recognised as mutual. They began as predator and prey, with the Ottoman Empire and its Crimean vassals holding for well over a century nearly all of the actual power, burning Russian towns, carrying off Russian captives by the tens of thousands into slave markets that operated, with grim and business-like regularity, on the Ottoman-controlled shores of the Black Sea, while the young and still-forming Russian state absorbed blow after blow with no realistic hope of striking back in kind. What this account is going to walk you through across the whole of tonight is not a single war and not a single grievance, but 3.5 centuries of accumulated reversal, war after war, treaty after treaty, each one individually explicable, each one fought for reasons that made a certain narrow sense to the people fighting it at the time, until a relationship that began with one empire burning the other's capital to the ground ended with that same relationship helping to bring both empires, the burner and the burned, crashing down within a handful of years of one another, two ancient houses that had spent 350 years locked in the same long, exhausting argument, finally falling silent together. Along the way, this account is going to ask you to hold a considerably more complicated picture in mind than the simple, satisfying story of righteous underdog triumphing over cruel oppressor that a shorter telling might prefer, because Russia's own eventual dominance was purchased through methods, mass expulsion, serfdom, and a domestic repression of its own subjects, every bit as troubling in their own right as anything this account is about to show you the Ottoman Empire inflicting on its captives and its conquered peoples, and because the Ottoman Empire, even at its own cruelest, produced moments of genuine tolerance, genuine military skill, and genuine human courage. This account refuses to erase simply because that empire eventually lost this long argument. This is not, in other words, a story with a hero, and it never quite becomes one, no matter how far into the night it runs. Before this account leads you any further into that long argument, take a moment now to like this video and to subscribe to this channel, though only if you are the kind of listener who genuinely enjoys settling into a long, unhurried night like this one. Because that really is the only honest reason to do either. This is still a fairly small channel, sitting right around 1,000 subscribers, and if you feel like helping us take a real step toward 10,000 tonight, it would mean a great deal to us, and it costs you nothing more than the click your thumb was probably about to make anyway. If you are watching this on YouTube, know that new episodes actually go up early over on Spotify for creators, so the link waiting in the description below will let you hear whatever comes next before almost anyone else does. And if you found your way here the other direction, arriving tonight from Spotify, we would love it if you searched Historian at Midnight on YouTube and subscribe there too, so that this small channel keeps growing on both sides of the same house at once. And if it suits you, drop your city and your local time into the comments before you drift off, not because it changes one single thing about tonight's story, but because it is a quietly comforting thing to know that somewhere else on this same turning planet, at some entirely different hour, another tired stranger is listening to the same old argument between two empires slowly working itself out. So let whatever is holding you upright right now finally give way, whether that means sinking a little deeper into the pillow beneath you, or simply letting the room around you go soft and unfocused at the edges, and let the next several hours belong to two houses so old and so enormous that most of what happened between them has been flattened, in the retelling most people already know, into a handful of famous names, a handful of famous wars, and almost nothing about the ordinary human cost. Each one of those wars actually extracted from the people standing closest to it. We begin, as this account has already shown you, on the losing side of that story, in a burning wooden city on the banks of a river called the Moskva, watching an empire that did not yet exist in any recognizable form begin, out of sheer necessity, the long and unglamorous work of learning how to survive its own far more powerful southern neighbour. Let the shape of that survival unfold slowly for you tonight, the way it actually unfolded across 3.5 centuries of real lived time, not as a single dramatic turning point, but as a long accumulation of small and large decisions, each one made by people who could not see, any more clearly than you or this account can see tonight, exactly where the next century of consequences would eventually lead. Let your own breathing slow to match the pace this story is going to keep, unhurried, patient, willing to sit inside a single burning city or a single frozen mountain pass for as long as that moment actually deserves before moving on to the next one, because that is the only honest way a rivalry this large and this old can actually be told. To understand why a Crimean Khan riding under an Ottoman banner could burn Moscow to the ground in 1571 without meeting any serious resistance, it is worth going back further still, to a period this story could not properly begin without. The roughly 2.5 centuries during which the Russian principalities existed not as an independent power of any kind, but as tribute-paying subjects of a vast Mongol-descended state called the Golden Horde, a Khanate that had swept across the Eastern European steppe in the 13th century and had, by the time its own power finally began to fracture in the 14th and 15th centuries, left behind a political habit that would shape Russian statecraft for generations afterward. The understanding, hammered into every Russian prince who came of age under Mongol overlordship, that survival meant paying whoever held the whip hand, and that the whip hand on the open steppe nearly always belonged to whichever mounted power could move fastest and strike hardest. it was only in 1480, under a Muscovite Grand Prince named Ivan III, that this tribute finally ended in any formal sense, in a tense and largely bloodless standoff along a river called the Ugra that Russian chroniclers would later remember, with a certain understandable pride, as the Great Stand, the moment the Mongol yoke was finally, officially thrown off after 240 years. But a yoke does not vanish from a people's collective memory simply because a treaty says it has ended, and the several successor khanates that splintered off from the dying Golden Horde, Kazan on the Middle Volga, Astrakhan where the Volga meets the Caspian, and Crimea on the northern shore of the Black Sea, continued, each in its own way, to treat the Russian lands to their north and west as a resource to be raided rather than a neighbour to be respected, a habit that the Crimean Khanate in particular would carry forward with grim and businesslike consistency for a further 3 centuries. It is worth picturing, honestly and in some real detail, what the actual moment along the Ugra River in 1480 must have felt like to the soldiers standing on either bank of it, because the Great Stand was not, whatever its own later legendary status in Russian memory, a single dramatic battle with a clear winner and a clear loser, but a tense weeks-long standoff in which the army of the Golden Horde's own last would-be unifying Khan, a ruler named Akhmat, faced the assembled forces of Ivan III across a river neither side ultimately chose to cross in force, both armies watching each other through the shortening autumn days, both commanders weighing the very real risk of a battle that could go badly wrong against the considerable cost of simply waiting the season out until the first hard frosts arrived, and Akhmat, receiving word that his own rear areas were under attack from a rival power, and increasingly unable to supply an army that had already eaten through its own local forage, withdrew without ever forcing the crossing his own presence had threatened all autumn. It is a strange and genuinely instructive way for 2.5 centuries of tribute and subjugation to end, not in a thunderous climactic battle of the kind popular memory generally prefers, but in a long, anxious waiting game decided, in the end, by logistics and weather, and a rival's opportunism, rather than by any single heroic clash of arms. And it is worth naming that quieter, less cinematic truth here plainly, because this whole account has already promised you, and will keep promising you across the rest of tonight, that the real history sitting underneath this rivalry's own famous legends is very often exactly this much less dramatic, and very often exactly this much more human than the legend prefers to remember. Akhmat himself did not long survive his own retreat, murdered only months later by a rival Khan in a separate steppe power struggle, entirely unconnected to Moscow. A genuinely unglamorous end for the last Golden Horde ruler ever to seriously threaten Muscovite independence, dying not in the dramatic confrontation his own army's march to the Ugra had promised, but in an obscure feud among his own steppe rivals that had nothing at all to do with the empire he had spent that same autumn trying to hold together. It is worth dwelling too, a little longer than most retellings bother to, on what the Cossack communities this account has already begun introducing you to, tonight actually were, because the word itself, borrowed from a Turkic root meaning something close to free adventurer or masterless man, describes considerably more than a simple military occupation. These were communities built, quite deliberately, out of people who had chosen, or been forced by circumstance, to live beyond the reach of any settled state's own tax collectors and any landlord's own bailiffs, runaway serfs, escaped debtors, religious dissenters, and simple adventurers drawn to a frontier existence organised around elected leadership, communal land use, and a fierce, jealously guarded independence that made the Cossacks genuinely difficult for any distant government, Muscovite or Ottoman or Polish-Lithuanian alike, to fully control even when that government nominally claimed their loyalty. Life along the Don or the lower Dnieper meant a rhythm of fishing, hunting, seasonal raiding, and near-constant vigilance against exactly the kind of sudden, mounted attack this account has already described the Crimean Tatars capable of launching. a frontier existence that produced, across generations, a genuinely distinct culture of horsemanship, small unit tactics, and communal self-defense that both the Russian state and the Ottoman Empire would, across the coming centuries, find themselves by turns fighting against, recruiting from, and relying upon, sometimes within the very same decade. There is one further piece of background this account owes you before it can properly begin the long march of wars still ahead of you tonight, because without it, much of what follows will sound like simple territorial appetite rather than what it actually was, a claim carried, generation after generation, at the very centre of how Russia's own rulers understood their state's place in the world. In 1472, only a handful of years before Mengli Ure accepted Ottoman suzerainty over Crimea, the same Ivan III who would later face down the Golden Horde at the Ugra married a Byzantine princess named Sophia Palaiologina, a niece of the very last Byzantine emperor whose own empire had fallen to Ottoman conquest less than 2 decades earlier in 1453, and with that marriage Moscow's own rulers began, deliberately and self-consciously, adopting the trappings of the fallen Byzantine imperial tradition, the double-headed eagle that had marked Byzantine authority now stamped onto Muscovite seals and banners, and a court monk named Philophe giving that adoption its own enduring theological language only a few decades later, declaring that 2 Romes had already fallen, the first to barbarian invasion and the second, Constantinople, to the Ottoman conquest this account has already named, and that Moscow now stood as a 3rd Rome, with no 4th Rome ever to follow it, a claim to be not merely a powerful state, but the last and rightful inheritor of Christian Roman authority on earth. This account would ask you to carry that claim with you across the whole of tonight's long story, because it means that when Russian Tsars, generation after generation, reached for Constantinople and the straits beside it, they were never reaching only for a port or a trade route, but for a city their own state had spent centuries teaching itself to regard as its own true and rightful inheritance, stolen by the same empire this whole night is describing, and never, in the deepest and most ideologically loaded sense a Russian ruler could mean it, actually given up. It is worth naming too that Sophia herself brought considerably more than symbolism to this marriage, because contemporary accounts credit her, and the retinue of Greek and Italian scholars, architects and clergy who travelled north alongside her, with a real and lasting influence on the Muscovite court's own ceremonial life, its own architecture, and its own sense of dynastic grandeur. Several of the very Kremlin buildings that still stand in Moscow today, first raised by Italian architect Sophia herself, is credited with bringing into Ivan's own service a foreign woman's own quiet, largely unheralded influence, reshaping the physical and ideological foundations of a state that would, across the following centuries, grow to challenge the very empire that had driven her own family from its ancestral throne in the first place. It was the Crimean Khanate's own decision in 1475 that would ultimately braid these 2 stories together into the single long argument this whole night is going to trace. Because in that year an Ottoman fleet and army seized the Genoese trading colony of Kaffa on the Crimean coast, and in the aftermath of that conquest the reigning Crimean Khan, a ruler named Mengli I Ure, accepted Ottoman suzerainty, becoming from that point forward a vassal of the Sultan in Constantinople rather than an independent power in his own right. It is worth naming plainly what that vassal relationship actually meant in practice, because it was not the kind of ceremonial, largely symbolic overlordship this account has described in other contexts on other nights, but a genuinely functional military alliance in which the Crimean Khan's own cavalry, some of the fastest and most feared raiders on the entire Eurasian steppe, became, in effect, the Sultan's own northern sword, launching raid after raid against the Christian populations of Poland, Lithuania, and above all the Russian lands, carrying off captives by the tens of thousands nearly every single year. Captives who are marched south to the slave markets of Kaffa itself, and sold onward into a trade so large and so continuous that some modern historians estimate the total number of people taken from the Russian and Ukrainian lands across the roughly 3 centuries this trade operated may run into the millions. A hidden, grinding, generation after generation catastrophe that receives, even now, only a small fraction of the attention its own scale actually deserves. It is worth naming too exactly what Kaffa itself actually looked like at the height of this trade, because contemporary visitors to the city, a thriving multicultural port that had once belonged to Genoese merchants trading across the entire Black Sea basin, described its own slave market as one of the largest and most continuously active anywhere in the early modern world. Auction blocks and holding pens operating with the same businesslike, unremarkable regularity as any ordinary grain market. Buyers arriving from across the Ottoman world to purchase captives bound for households, galleys and harems, scattered from the Balkans to the edge of Persia. An entire regional economy built, in significant and sustained part, on exactly the kind of raid this account has already described, devastating village after village across the Russian and Ukrainian borderlands, a genuinely industrial-scale human trafficking operation that ran, with only occasional interruption, for roughly 3 full centuries before Catherine's own conquest finally shut it down for good, a closure this account would ask you to hold in mind as one of the genuinely unambiguous humanitarian achievements this whole long rivalry ever produced, whatever else this night has asked you to weigh against it. It is worth pausing on that slave trade a little longer than most retellings of this rivalry bother to, because it is the single clearest, most human-scale explanation for why the relationship this whole night is describing began with such lopsided and one-directional violence. Picture, if you can bear to, what it actually meant for a small farming village somewhere in the borderlands south of Moscow to live, generation after generation, under the standing knowledge that spring and summer, the very seasons that should have meant planting and growth and the ordinary rhythms of an agricultural life, were also, with grim and predictable regularity, raiding season. The months when a mounted Tatar column might appear on the horizon with no warning at all, burn whatever could not be carried away, and vanish southward again with a column of captives roped together behind them. Captives who would, in an overwhelming number of cases, never see their own families again. Sold instead into households and galleys and harems scattered across an Ottoman world that stretched, by this point from the Balkans to the edge of Persia. Russian and Ukrainian folk memory preserved this terror for centuries, in the form of songs and laments about captives never returning, about mothers left standing at the edge of a burned field with nothing left to bury, and it is against exactly this backdrop of accumulated, grinding, largely uncounted suffering that the far more famous wars this account is about to describe eventually took shape, because a state that spends 2.5 centuries watching its own southern border bleed slowly and continuously does not, when it finally gains the strength to strike back, generally do so gently. The first serious attempt by the young Muscovite state to actually push back against this arrangement came under a ruler whose name would eventually become a byword in the English language itself for a particular kind of dangerous unpredictability, Ivan IV, remembered to history as Ivan the Terrible. Crowned in 1547 as the first Muscovite ruler to take the title of Tsar, a Russian rendering of the ancient Roman title Caesar, deliberately chosen to signal an ambition considerably larger than the regional principality his predecessors had actually ruled. It was Ivan who, in 1552, led his own army to the conquest of the Khanate of Kazan, one of the successor states of the old Golden Horde sitting astride the Middle Volga, and it was Ivan again, 4 years later in 1556, who conquered the Khanate of Astrakhan, the successor Khanate controlling the mouth of the Volga, where it emptied into the Caspian Sea, 2 conquests that, taken together, gave Muscovy for the first time direct control over the entire length of the Volga River, and, just as significantly, brought Muscovite power for the first time into direct geographic contact with territory the Ottoman Sultan considered part of his own sphere of interest. It is worth naming, honestly, what those two conquests actually meant for the Muslim populations of Kazan and Astrakhan themselves, because a fully truthful accounting cannot describe Ivan's own campaigns purely as a triumphant expansion of Muscovite power, without also naming their cost to the people already living in the territory he conquered. The fall of Kazan in 1552 was followed by a massacre of a considerable portion of the city's own defenders and inhabitants, and by a subsequent and sustained campaign of forced conversion and church building across the wider Khanate's own former territory that pressured the region's Muslim Tatar population across the following decades to abandon much of its own religious and institutional independence, a policy of cultural absorption considerably less dramatic in any single moment than the burning of a city, but one whose own cumulative cost across the generations that followed, this account would ask you to remember, sits on the same long ledger as every other conquest tonight's story is going to describe, regardless of which empire happened to be doing the conquering. Ivan himself commemorated his own conquest of Kazan in a manner that still stands, quite literally, at the very centre of Moscow today, commissioning the cathedral now known as St. Basil's, its riot of colourful onion domes rising above Red Square specifically to mark the victory this account has just described. A building that has become, in the centuries since, one of the single most recognisable images of Russia itself, a monument to a conquest whose own human cost the overwhelming majority of the millions of tourists who photograph it every year have very likely never once been told to consider. It is worth naming, too, at least a handful of the many ordinary lives this long rivalry passed through, and rarely bothered to record with anything like the same care it gave its generals and its treaties, because a story built this heavily around czars and sultans and field marshals risks letting the ordinary people who actually paid for their decisions disappear into the background entirely. There was, somewhere among the tens of thousands of captives the Crimean slave trade carried south across 2.5 centuries, an unnamed Ukrainian girl captured as a teenager in a raid very much like the one this account described at the very start of tonight, marched south to the slave markets of Kaffa and sold onward into a household or a harem or a galley bench. This account has no way of specifying any further. One single life standing in, as honestly as this account can manage, for the many thousands upon thousands of captives whose own names and whose own fates were never recorded by anyone at all. There was an anonymous Don Cossack, one among the several hundred who held Azov's own walls, through 5 years of siege on nothing more than their own stubbornness and Moscow's unfulfilled promises, whose own petition for support survives today only as an unsigned fragment in a Russian archive, a single voice standing in for a garrison history otherwise remembers only as a collective noun. There was a Bulgarian peasant woman in the town of Batak in 1876, whose own name this account cannot give you because no surviving record preserved it, one of several thousand who did not survive the massacre this story has already described. And there was, on the very same rivalry's opposite and equally uncounted side, an Ottoman soldier freezing to death in the mountain passes above Sarikamish in the winter of 1914, a conscript from some Anatolian village whose own family would have received, if they received anything at all, only the barest official notice that their son had died in service, with no further detail about where or how. This account cannot give any of these individual lives back to you in full, and it will not pretend otherwise, but it can, at least, say their kind of life out loud once more before the night is through. The ordinary people this whole enormous rivalry was always, in the end, actually made of. It is worth naming honestly here exactly what kind of ruler was responsible for that expansion, because a fully truthful accounting of this rivalry cannot introduce Ivan the Terrible only as the conqueror of Kazan and Astrakhan, without also naming what his own reign became in its own final and darkest decade. In 1565, only a handful of years after his own triumph at Astrakhan, Ivan divided his own realm in two, carving out for himself a private domain called the Oprichnina, and unleashing upon it a corps of black-robed enforcers who answered to no law and no court beyond the Tsar's own personal will, a reign of terror that fell, with a cruelty many contemporary foreign observers described as almost impossible to credit, on Ivan's own Russian subjects rather than on any Tatar or Ottoman enemy, culminating in 1570, only a single year before Devlet Giuray's own cavalry burned Moscow to the ground in the sack of the Russian city of Novgorod, where Ivan's own Oprichniki massacred, by the more careful modern estimates, somewhere in the range of several thousand of the Tsar's own subjects on suspicion of a treason historians today consider almost entirely fabricated. This account names it here plainly because the same both-hands honesty it has already promised you tonight applies just as fully to Ivan as to any Ottoman sultan this story will go on to introduce. The ruler who first pushed Muscovite power into direct contact with the Ottoman world was also, in the very same decade, a ruler whose own paranoid cruelty toward his own people rivals almost anything either empire would ever inflict on the other, and a story honest enough to blame Devlet Giuray fully for what his own cavalry did to Moscow in 1571 owes its listeners the same honesty about what Ivan had already done to Novgorod the year before. It is worth being honest at this early point in the story about exactly how the Ottoman court in Constantinople reacted to that expansion, because the reaction it produced tells you a great deal about how seriously the empire, still at the very height of its own power under the aging Suleiman the Magnificent, took the appearance of this new and unfamiliar northern rival. In 1569, an Ottoman army, acting in coordination with the Sultan's own Crimean vassals, marched north with an ambitious and genuinely audacious plan to besiege and retake Astrakhan from the Russians and, in the same campaign, to dig a canal connecting the Don and Volga rivers, a project that would have allowed Ottoman galleys to sail directly from the Black Sea into the Caspian, projecting Ottoman naval power into a body of water no Ottoman ship had ever previously reached. The campaign, in the end, failed almost completely, defeated as much by the sheer scale and logistical difficulty of the terrain as by any Russian military resistance. The canal digging abandoned half-finished, and the besieging army withdrawing in considerable disorder before winter set in, and it is worth naming this failed campaign here, near the very beginning of tonight's account, as the first direct military clash in a rivalry that would eventually stretch across 3.5 centuries and dozens of further wars, a clash that ended this first time in Ottoman failure. Though nobody standing on either side of that failed campaign in 1569 could have known they had just fought the opening skirmish of something so enormous. It is worth naming too that the Don-Volga Canal project this failed campaign abandoned was not, in the end, a fantasy without merit, because a canal joining those two rivers was eventually completed by Soviet engineers in 1952, nearly 4 centuries after the Ottoman army first attempted it, a small and almost wistful footnote confirming that the campaign's own underlying strategic logic had been sound all along, even though the empire that first attempted it had neither the engineering capacity nor the logistical reach, in 1569, to actually see it through. The Crimean Khanate, however, was not finished, and it was the Crimean Khanate, acting once again as the Sultan's own instrument on the northern steppe, that delivered the catastrophe this account opened with tonight. The burning of Moscow in 1571 under Devlet I Giuray, an attack launched in direct response to Ivan's own conquests of Kazan and Astrakhan, and intended, quite explicitly, to punish Muscovy for its growing ambitions, and to remind both Ivan and his own subjects exactly which power still held the whip hand on the open steppe. It succeeded almost completely. Devlet Giuray's own cavalry evaded the Russian defensive lines meant to intercept exactly this kind of raid, reached the outskirts of the city itself, and set fire to the wooden suburbs surrounding the stone Kremlin at the city's centre, a fire that spread, in the dry spring wind, with a speed and totality that even the raiders themselves seem not to have fully anticipated. consuming nearly the entire city within a matter of hours, and killing, by the most careful modern estimates, somewhere between tens of thousands and, by some accounts, well over 100,000 people. A death toll so catastrophic for a single city in a single week that it stands, even now, among the deadliest urban disasters anywhere in early modern European history, and one that receives, this account would argue, only a small fraction of the attention a catastrophe of that scale would receive had it happened to a city whose own name history had already decided to remember more sympathetically. It would have been entirely reasonable, standing in the ashes of that burned city in the summer of 1571, to predict that Muscovy's southern frontier would remain exactly what it had always been, a killing field the Ottoman Empire's own Crimean vassals could cross whenever the Sultan's own interest required it. And yet the very next year, in 1572, that prediction was already beginning to unravel, because Devlet-Giray, emboldened by the previous summer's success, and reportedly promising the Sultan nothing less than the outright reconquest of Kazan and Astrakhan, led a second, even larger invasion north, and this time the Russian defenders, commanded by a general named Mikhail Vorotinsky, met that invasion at a village called Molody, roughly 40 miles south of the very city the same army had burned to the ground 12 months earlier, and inflicted upon it a defeat so total and so unexpected that the Crimean Khanate's own capacity to seriously threaten Muscovite territory would not fully recover for a generation. It is worth naming the Battle of Molody here plainly, because it receives, in nearly every popular retelling of this era, a small fraction of the attention the far more dramatic burning of Moscow receives, despite the fact that historians specialising in this period consider it, by several measures, the more strategically decisive of the two engagements, the moment at which the balance of power on the Pontic steppe, which had run overwhelmingly in the Ottoman Crimean direction for well over a century, first, faintly, began to tilt the other way. It is worth naming, briefly, exactly what actually happened across the several days of fighting at Molody, because the battle's own comparative obscurity has nothing to do with any lack of drama in how it was actually won. Vorotinsky's own outnumbered Russian force fought from behind a mobile fortification called a Gulye-Gorod, a walking city, wooden wagons and portable wooden walls lashed together into a moving barricade that Russian infantry and artillery could shelter behind, while Tatar cavalry, accustomed to facing open steppe formations they could simply outmaneuver, broke themselves repeatedly against a defence that refused to hold still long enough to be outflanked, until a final Russian sortie from behind that same barricade broke the exhausted Tatar and Ottoman force outright, killing, by several surviving estimates, a very substantial proportion of the entire invading army, including a considerable number of the Crimean Khan's own extended family, a defeat so total that Devlet-Giray himself, the same commander who had burned Moscow so completely only a year earlier, is said to have returned home with only a small remnant of the force he had led north with such confidence. It is worth returning briefly to the burning city this account opened with tonight, because a single sentence describing a death toll, however carefully estimated, can never fully carry what a catastrophe of that scale actually felt like from inside it. Foreign merchants and diplomats who arrived in Moscow in the weeks after the fire described a city reduced almost entirely to ash and blackened stone, the Moskva River itself, by more than one surviving account, so choked with bodies that its own current could barely be seen moving beneath them, and a stench hanging over the ruined city for weeks afterward that later travellers claimed they could still detect from a considerable distance outside its own walls. Families who had lived their whole lives inside the wooden city's own crowded streets returned, in the fire's immediate aftermath, to find no threshold, no hearth, no single surviving wall to mark where a home had once stood, only ash indistinguishable from the ash of the house that had stood beside it. And it is worth sitting, honestly, with how completely that kind of destruction erases not only lives, but the ordinary, everyday evidence that those lives had ever been lived there at all, the same kind of erasure this account will ask you to notice again, more than once across the whole of tonight's much longer story. And it is worth naming plainly before this account moves forward into the 17th century that the raiding this long rivalry produced was never quite so purely one-directional as the burning of Moscow alone might suggest, because the same Cossack communities this story is about to introduce you to at Azov had, by the early decades of the 1600s, developed a raiding tradition of their own, considerably more audacious than most popular retellings of this rivalry ever bother to mention. Zaporozhian Cossacks based along the lower Dnieper built shallow, fast river and seaboats called chaikas, and launched them, summer after summer, directly across the Black Sea against Ottoman coastal towns, sacking Sinop in 1614, burning the outskirts of the great port city of Kaffa itself, the same city whose own slave markets had once processed so many captured Russian and Ukrainian villagers, and in 1615 and again in 1620, rowing close enough to the Ottoman capital itself to burn suburban districts, within sight of the Sultan's own palace at Constantinople. A genuinely startling feat of small boat seamanship that forced the Ottoman government to divert real naval resources toward coastal defence it had, until that point, rarely needed to seriously consider. This account names these raids here honestly, not to excuse the far larger and far more one-sided suffering the Crimean slave trade inflicted across the same century, but because a rivalry this long deserves to be remembered in its own full and complicated shape. And the ledger between these two peoples was never, at any single point across the whole 3.5 centuries this account is tracing, quite so simple as one side only striking and the other only suffering. Progress of that kind, this account would ask you to notice early and remember throughout the whole of tonight, was never going to arrive as a single dramatic reversal, a single battle after which everything suddenly changed. It arrived instead the way most genuine historical reversals actually arrive, in fits and starts, forward for a generation and backward for the next, an entire dynasty's worth of Muscovite rulers spending the following century absorbed by internal crises, a period of dynastic collapse and foreign invasion Russian history remembers as the time of troubles, consuming the first years of the 17th century so completely that the southern frontier this story has been describing received, for a time, considerably less attention than the more immediate threats of Polish and Swedish invasion closer to Moscow itself. It was only with the gradual stabilization of a new ruling dynasty, the Romanovs beginning in 1613, that Muscovy's attention could return, with any real consistency, to the long, unresolved argument still simmering along its southern border, and it returned there first not through the Tsar's own regular army at all, but through a genuinely remarkable population of frontier warriors this story has not yet properly introduced, the Cossacks. The Cossacks deserve a fuller introduction here than most tellings of this rivalry bother to give them, because for well over a century they functioned as something considerably more complicated than simple subjects of the Tsar, communities of free, self-governing frontiersmen, many of them descended from runaway serfs and adventurers who had fled deeper into the open steppe, precisely to escape the tightening bonds of Muscovite serfdom, organising themselves into fortified river settlements along the Don and the Dnieper, and answering, when they answered to anyone at all, to their own elected leaders, rather than to any distant Tsar's court. It was a band of these Don Cossacks who, in 1637, without any formal authorization from Moscow at all, captured the Ottoman fortress of Azov at the mouth of the river that shared its name, a fortress that had guarded Ottoman access to the Sea of Azov and, beyond it, the Black Sea, for well over a century, and who then held that fortress against repeated Ottoman attempts to retake it for a further 5 years, a remarkable feat of independent frontier warfare Russian history remembers as the Azov Siege, or sometimes the Azov Sitting. In 1642, having held the fortress far longer than anyone, including the Cossacks themselves, had genuinely expected, the Don Cossacks formally offered Azov to the Tsar, Michael Romanov, asking him to accept the fortress as a permanent addition to his own domain and to send regular troops to help defend it against the Ottoman counterattack that was certain to follow. It is worth naming honestly what Michael Romanov actually chose to do with that offer, because it complicates any tidy story of steady, inevitable Russian expansion this account might otherwise be tempted to tell. Convening an assembly of the realm called a Zemsky Sobor to weigh the decision, the Tsar's own government concluded that Muscovy, still recovering from the exhaustion of the time of troubles and unwilling to risk a full-scale war against the still formidable Ottoman Empire over a single frontier fortress, could not afford to accept the Cossacks' gift, and in 1642 the Cossacks, receiving no support from Moscow, abandoned Azov and withdrew, allowing Ottoman forces to reoccupy the fortress, essentially unopposed. It is worth pausing briefly on what daily life for an ordinary Don Cossack manning Azov's own captured walls across those 5 years actually looked like, because the surviving petitions the Cossacks sent to Moscow pleading for support describe conditions considerably harsher than the romantic image of free frontier warriors might otherwise suggest. A garrison chronically short of gunpowder and grain, reinforced only irregularly by fellow Cossacks willing to risk the same siege, and facing in 1641 alone an Ottoman and Crimean besieging force the Cossacks' own petitions describe as outnumbering them by a margin of many to one, an assault the defenders survived only through a combination of the fortress's own strong walls and a stubbornness that Moscow's own eventual refusal to accept their gift must have made feel to the men who had actually held those walls like a considerable and genuinely bitter betrayal. The 1641 siege alone, by the Cossacks' own later account, saw the defenders repel more than 20 separate Ottoman assaults across a period of several months, mining and countermining beneath their own walls in a grinding underground struggle that cost both sides heavily before the besieging army finally withdrew. Exhausted, having failed to dislodge a garrison, Moscow itself had refused to formally acknowledge as its own. It would be more than half a century before Azov's fate was seriously contested again, and when it finally was, it would be contested not by an informal band of frontier Cossacks acting on their own initiative, but by the full and deliberate weight of a young Tsar determined, more than any ruler before him, to drag his own country by force into direct and sustained confrontation with the Ottoman world. That young Tsar's name was Peter, and his own story deserves considerably more room in this account than a single passing mention, because it was Peter who first turned Russia's long, uneven southern grievance into a matter of deliberate state policy rather than opportunistic frontier warfare. Peter had come to the throne as a child amid a genuinely chaotic succession crisis, had spent much of his own adolescence playing war games with mock regiments recruited from the villages surrounding his family's summer estates, games that were, in retrospect, considerably more serious in their intent than anyone around the young Tsar seems to have fully appreciated at the time, and had grown by the time he assumed full personal control of the government in 1689, into a ruler consumed by a genuine, almost obsessive fascination with the naval and military technology of Western Europe, a fascination that would eventually reshape the entire trajectory of the Russo-Ottoman relationship this account is tracing tonight. It is worth being honest, too, about the considerable personal cost Peter's own drive to remake his country exacted on the people closest to him, because a fully truthful portrait of this Tsar cannot simply celebrate the shipyard labour and the naval ambition without also naming what that same restless, uncompromising temperament did to his own family. In 1698, while Peter was travelling abroad on the Grand Embassy this account has already described, a rebellion by the Streltsy, the old palace guard regiments Peter had never fully trusted, brought him rushing home to crush the uprising with a severity that shocked even hardened foreign observers, personally overseeing interrogations and executions that, by several surviving accounts, Peter himself took some direct hand in carrying out. And it was Peter's own son and heir, Alexei, who suffered the most lasting consequence of his father's own uncompromising nature, arrested in 1718 on suspicion of conspiring against his father's reforms, tried and sentenced to death, dying in his own prison cell under circumstances that remain to this day genuinely disputed, whether from the torture he had already endured during interrogation or from some further violence historians still cannot fully confirm. This account names it here plainly because the same Tsar who laboured with his own hands to build the fleet that finally took Azov was also, in the very same decades, a ruler capable of a domestic ruthlessness that makes any simple celebratory reading of his reign considerably harder to sustain than the shipyard legend alone would suggest. It is worth naming too exactly how deliberately and how personally Peter set about remaking the ordinary texture of Russian life once he returned from his own travels abroad, because his own southern ambitions against the Ottoman Empire were always bound up, in Peter's own mind, with a much wider project of forcing his own country to resemble the Western Europe he had just spent months studying with his own eyes. He imposed a tax on beards, requiring Russian noblemen who wished to keep the long facial hair orthodox tradition had always associated with piety and dignity to pay for the privilege, personally shaving several boyars' beards with his own hands at a welcome home celebration shortly after returning from the Grand Embassy, a genuinely theatrical act of political symbolism that shocked and humiliated men who had spent their entire lives regarding a full beard as inseparable from their own religious identity. He reformed the calendar, reformed the alphabet, founded a new capital city, St. Petersburg, built quite literally from marshland on the Baltic coast specifically to serve as Russia's own window onto Western Europe, and created an entirely new social hierarchy called the Table of Ranks, allowing commoners who distinguished themselves in state or military service to rise into the nobility on merit rather than birth alone. A genuinely radical reform for its own era that this account names here because it shows you plainly that the same restless energy that built a fleet to take Azov was never, for Peter, separable from a much larger and much more personal ambition to remake his own country from the ground up, an ambition his failure on the banks of the Pruth could dent but never fully extinguish. Peter's first serious military campaign as an independent ruler was, fittingly enough, an attempt to finally settle the unfinished business of Azov, and it is worth being honest about how badly that first attempt actually went, because Peter's own reputation as a military reformer has, in the centuries since, sometimes obscured just how thoroughly his first campaign against the Ottoman fortress failed. In 1695, Peter led a Russian army south to besiege Azov, and the siege collapsed in humiliating disarray, undermined by a Russian army that lacked any meaningful naval component at all, unable to prevent Ottoman ships from resupplying the fortress by sea, even as Russian land forces attempted, with steadily diminishing confidence, to starve it out from the landward side. Peter, rather than accepting that failure as final, drew from it precisely the lesson this account would argue defines his entire reign, that Russia's inability to project power southward was not primarily a matter of insufficient soldiers, but of a near-total absence of naval capability, and he spent the following winter driving forward with a personal, hands-on intensity that genuinely startled his own court, the construction of Russia's first significant navy at shipyards hastily established on the Don River near Voronezh, a fleet built in significant part through Peter's own direct physical labour alongside his shipwrights, a detail contemporary accounts insist upon repeatedly, and one that speaks to something genuinely distinctive about this particular Tsar's own relationship to power, an unwillingness, unusual among European monarchs of his own era, to direct a project of this scale from a comfortable distance rather than from inside the shipyard itself. It is worth naming too that the 1695 failure had cost Peter more than simple military embarrassment. Several thousand Russian soldiers lost to disease and to failed assaults across a siege that dragged on through the summer heat, with no realistic prospect of success, a defeat Peter absorbed by every surviving account not with resignation but with the same restless, almost manic determination that would go on to characterize the whole of his later reign, returning to Moscow that autumn, already sketching plans for the shipyard that would, within a single year, entirely reverse his own fortune. That new fleet returned to Azov in 1696, and this time the outcome was entirely different. The Russian navy successfully blockading the fortress from the sea, while Russian land forces pressed the siege from land, and Azov, after 59 years of contested and interrupted history, stretching back to the Cossacks' own original capture in 1637, finally fell into permanent Russian hands, or at least what its captors genuinely believed in that moment of triumph would be permanent hands. Peter celebrated the victory with the kind of elaborate, deliberately theatrical public ceremony that would become one of his own signature methods of reshaping how his subjects understood their own state's place in the world, and he followed that victory in 1697 and 1698 with an extraordinary and genuinely unprecedented journey, travelling incognito across Western Europe as part of what came to be called the Grand Embassy, working for a time with his own hands in the shipyards of the Dutch Republic and England to study Western naval construction directly rather than relying on second-hand reports, a journey undertaken in significant part to recruit the shipbuilders, engineers and naval officers Peter believed his own country would need if it hoped to sustain the kind of southern expansion. Azov's capture had only just begun. It is worth naming in a little more detail than most retellings of this rivalry bother to give it, exactly how strange that journey must have looked to the ordinary Dutch and English workers who actually shared a shipyard bench with the man travelling under it. Peter insisted throughout the embassy on being addressed only as Peter Mikhailov, a junior member of his own delegation rather than its reigning sovereign, a disguise that fooled almost no one who actually met him, given his own famously enormous height and the deference the rest of his party could not quite manage to fully conceal. But that allowed him, by his own later account, to work an ordinary labourer's hours in the shipyards of Zaandam in the Dutch Republic, and later at the Royal Dockyards in Deptford, England, learning the practical craft of hull construction with his own hands, rather than receiving it second-hand through court intermediaries the way nearly every other reigning monarch in Europe would have insisted on doing. He toured anatomy theatres and dissection rooms with a curiosity contemporary hosts found almost unseemly in a crowned head of state, inspected printing presses and windmills and hospitals with the same restless hands-on attention he brought to the shipyards themselves, and recruited across the many months of the embassy's own travels several hundred foreign specialists, shipwrights, engineers, gunnery experts and naval officers willing to return with him to Russia and help build the institutions his own country still lacked. The embassy itself was cut short in the summer of 1698 by urgent news of the Streltsy rebellion this account has already described, forcing Peter to abandon a planned continuation of his own tour through Venice and hurry home to crush that uprising in person. But the several hundred foreign specialists he had already recruited and the practical shipbuilding knowledge he had acquired with his own two hands would go on to form the backbone of the very fleet that returned to Azov in 1696. A debt to a handful of anonymous Dutch and English shipwrights, this account would ask you to remember, sits quietly underneath every later Russian naval triumph the rest of tonight's story is about to describe. It is worth naming, honestly, exactly how quickly this hard-won momentum stalled, because the wider strategic picture facing Peter's Russia shifted dramatically in the years immediately following Azov's capture, drawing Russia's attention northward into a far larger, and in the end, far more consequential conflict, the Great Northern War against Sweden, a struggle that would consume the majority of Peter's own remaining reign, and that would, by its own eventual conclusion, establish Russia as a genuine European great power for the first time in its history. But that also meant the southern frontier this account has been tracing tonight was, for the better part of 2 decades, relegated to a secondary theatre, defended and administered, but rarely the focus of Peter's own personal attention in the way Azov's capture had briefly made it. That secondary status changed abruptly and disastrously in 1711, when Peter, drawn into a wider diplomatic crisis after granting refuge to a defeated Swedish king who had fled into Ottoman territory, found himself at war with the Sultan once again, this time leading his own army personally into Ottoman Moldavia along the banks of the River Pruth. The Pruth River campaign of 1711 deserves to be told honestly and in full, because it stands as one of the single most humiliating chapters of Peter's own otherwise triumphant reign, and a fully honest account of this rivalry cannot simply skip past Russian defeats in its rush toward the eventual Russian victories this story will spend considerably more time describing later on. Peter's army, considerably smaller than he had anticipated, and suffering badly from a lack of adequate supply in the summer heat of the Moldavian steppe, found itself surrounded on the banks of the Pruth by a much larger Ottoman force, and for several tense days in July of 1711 it appeared entirely possible that the Tsar himself, along with the greater part of his own field army, might be captured or destroyed outright, an outcome that would have almost certainly ended Peter's reign and quite plausibly reshaped the entire subsequent history of both empires this account is describing tonight. It was only through a negotiated settlement, the Treaty of the Pruth, that catastrophe was averted, a treaty whose own terms required Peter to surrender Azov back to Ottoman control, to demolish the fortifications and the very shipyards at Taganrog he had built with such personal effort only 15 years earlier, and to withdraw entirely from the ambitions in the Black Sea region his whole southern strategy had, until that moment, been built around. It is worth sitting honestly with how complete that reversal actually was, because it complicates any simple, forward-marching narrative of Russian expansion this story might otherwise be tempted to tell. 15 years after personally labouring in a shipyard to build the fleet that finally took Azov, Peter the Great, arguably the single most consequential Russian ruler in the entire history of the state, was forced to watch that same fortress, along with the fleet and the fortifications built to hold it, dismantled and returned to Ottoman hands, a defeat so total that Russia's Black Sea ambitions would remain essentially frozen for a further quarter century after Peter's own death in 1725, and it is worth naming plainly here at this early hinge point in the story, the same both-hands honesty this account intends to apply to every ruler and every empire it describes tonight. The same Peter who reformed his country's army, built its first navy, and dragged an entire state by main force into the modern European order, also, on the banks of the Pruth in 1711, very nearly lost everything he had spent his whole reign building, saved not by his own genius, but by a negotiated settlement his own Ottoman opponents, for reasons historians still debate, chose to accept rather than press their considerable advantage any further. It is worth naming too what became of Peter's own southern ambitions in the years immediately following that humiliation, because rather than simply accepting the Pruth settlement as final, Peter redirected the same restless energy that had once built a navy at Voronezh toward an entirely different frontier, launching a campaign against Safavid Persia in 1722 that extended Russian influence along the western shore of the Caspian Sea, a theatre considerably removed from the Black Sea struggle this account is tracing tonight, but one that nonetheless reveals something worth remembering about Peter's own character, an inability, even after total and public humiliation, to simply set an ambition down and leave it there. The war that finally began to reverse the humiliation of the Pruth did not come until 1735, under a Russian empress named Anna Ioannovna, whose own reign is remembered today, this account would suggest somewhat unfairly, considerably less vividly than either Peter's before her or Catherine's after her, despite presiding over a genuinely significant renewal of Russian ambition against the Ottoman world. Anna's field marshal, a Baltic German nobleman named Burkhard Christoph von Munich, led Russian forces to a string of real successes across the campaigns of 1736 through 1739, recapturing Azov once again, storming into the Crimean Peninsula itself, and burning the Khan's own capital at Bakhchisarai, and pushing deep into Ottoman Moldavia, achievements that, on paper, represented the most significant Russian military success against the Ottoman Empire since Peter's brief triumph at Azov 4 decades earlier. It is worth naming honestly, though, exactly what those campaigns actually cost the army that won them, because Münch's own marches across the open steppe toward Crimea proved considerably more lethal to his own soldiers than any Ottoman or Tatar force he actually met in battle. Disease and simple thirst, killing Russian troops by the tens of thousands across these campaigns in numbers that dwarfed the army's own combat casualties. A pattern of attrition. This account will ask you to notice now because it will recur in one form or another in nearly every single campaign this long rivalry produced across the open steppe country separating these two empires, a terrain that punished both armies almost as severely as either army ever managed to punish the other. And yet, in the end, the Treaty of Belgrade that concluded this war in 1739 delivered Russia remarkably little of what its own battlefield successes might have seemed to promise, because Russia's Austrian ally, exhausted and defeated on its own separate front against the Ottomans, withdrew from the war and negotiated a separate peace, leaving Russia to settle for terms considerably less generous than its own military position alone would have justified. Terms that returned most of Münch's hard-won conquests and left Russia holding once again only Azov itself, this time with its fortifications specifically prohibited by treaty from being rebuilt, a diplomatic outcome that must have felt to the Russian officers who had actually fought and bled across those campaigns, like watching a genuine victory quietly converted at the negotiating table into something considerably closer to a draw. It is worth naming, too, exactly why Russia accepted terms this unfavourable, rather than continuing to fight alone, because a French diplomat serving as an intermediary in the final negotiations, working in his own government's interest to limit Russian gains at Ottoman expense, played a genuinely significant role in shaping a settlement that favoured Ottoman interests more than the actual battlefield situation warranted. One further early instance of a pattern this account has already shown you, and will show you again across the whole of tonight's remaining story, the outcome of this rivalry's own wars being decided as much in the negotiating rooms of uninvolved third powers as on the actual battlefields where Russian and Ottoman soldiers had done the fighting and the dying. It would take one further generation and one further ruler before this long, uneven, back-and-forth argument finally began to tilt decisively and durably in Russia's own favour, and that ruler's own name belongs at the very centre of tonight's story, in a way few other figures on either side of this rivalry can rival. Catherine, born a minor German princess and married as a teenager, into the Russian imperial family through a dynastic arrangement she had no meaningful say in, seized the Russian throne herself in 1762 through a palace coup that deposed, and shortly afterward resulted in the death of her own husband, Peter III, becoming, through a combination of genuine political skill and no small amount of ruthless calculation, the sole ruling empress of Russia for the following 34 years, a reign that would come to be remembered with real historical justification as Catherine the Great. It is worth naming, honestly, exactly what stood between Catherine's own coup and the 34 years of rule that followed it, because a German-born princess with no drop of Romanov blood in her own veins, who had just deposed and, however indirectly, caused the death of her own crowned husband, occupied a throne in 1762 whose own legitimacy rested on considerably shakier ground than any hereditary monarch this account has described tonight, and Catherine seems to have understood, with real political clarity, that the surest way to secure a throne she had no natural claim to was to win, for her own adopted country, the kind of dramatic military glory no domestic critic could easily argue with. It is worth remembering, too, that Catherine's own predecessor by only a single generation, an empress named Elizabeth, Peter the Great's own daughter, had ruled Russia for 2 relatively quiet decades between 1741 and 1762, in which the long argument this account has been tracing tonight had gone largely dormant, Elizabeth's own attention absorbed by the wider European struggle of the 7 Years' War, rather than by any renewed ambition against the Ottoman world, so that the war Catherine launched against the Ottoman Empire in 1768 arrived, in a very real sense, as the sudden reawakening of an argument an entire generation of Russians had grown up assuming was simply over. It is worth naming, too, exactly how precarious Catherine's own early reign actually felt from the inside, because a coup that had succeeded once could, in principle, succeed again against the very woman who had benefited from it, and Catherine spent her own first years on the throne working carefully to secure the loyalty of the palace guard regiments, whose own support had made her accession possible in the first place, aware, with a clarity few outsiders fully appreciated at the time, that a woman ruling by right of conquest rather than by right of birth could never afford to look weak for very long, a private insecurity this account would ask you to hold in mind as at least part of the explanation for why she pursued the Ottoman War once it arrived, with such sustained and uncompromising intensity. It is worth naming honestly, before this account turns to the war that made Catherine's own reputation, exactly what kind of ruler she actually was, because a fully truthful telling of her role in this rivalry cannot simply celebrate her considerable achievements without also naming the human cost several of those achievements actually extracted. Catherine governed a Russian state whose own economy still rested, to a degree that grows more uncomfortable the more closely one examines it, on the institution of serfdom, an institution that bound the overwhelming majority of the Russian peasantry to the land and to their own noble landlords in conditions many contemporary observers, and nearly every modern historian since, have rightly compared to a form of slavery in all but name, and it was Catherine's own reign, whatever else it accomplished, that saw serfdom's legal restrictions actually tighten rather than loosen, extending the institution's reach into newly conquered territories and granting Russian nobles even greater legal power over the peasants working their land. Whatever glory this account is about to describe Catherine winning on the battlefields of the Black Sea steppe, it is worth remembering, and this account intends to remember it more than once across the rest of tonight, that this same glory was purchased, in significant part, on the backs of a peasantry whose own condition Catherine's reign did essentially nothing to improve, and in several respects made measurably worse. And yet it is worth naming too the other half of this same contradiction, because Catherine cultivated across her own long reign a genuine and carefully maintained correspondence with the leading philosophers of the European Enlightenment, exchanging letters for years with Voltaire himself, who addressed her without any apparent irony as the Star of the North, and inviting the philosopher Denis Diderot to spend months as her own guest in St. Petersburg, presenting herself to a watching Europe as an enlightened monarch governing by reason rather than by the older, cruder logic of pure autocratic will. The gap between that carefully cultivated image and the actual condition of the millions of serfs whose labour funded it is worth sitting with honestly, because it is precisely the kind of both-hands contradiction this account has promised to hold open rather than resolve. A ruler capable of discussing liberty and reason in elegant French prose with the most celebrated minds in Europe, while signing, in the very same years, decrees that stripped her own peasantry of what little legal recourse they had previously possessed, a contradiction Catherine herself, by the testimony of several who knew her, seems never to have fully reconciled in her own mind either. The war that made Catherine's own reputation as an empire builder began in 1768, provoked in significant part by Russian intervention in the internal politics of neighbouring Poland, intervention the Ottoman court, urged on by its own French diplomatic allies, who had every interest in distracting Russian attention away from Poland, chose to answer with a declaration of war, a decision the Sultan's own government would, within a very few years, have every reason to regret bitterly. The war's opening land campaigns, fought across the Danubian principalities under the command of a Russian general named Pyotr Rumyantsev, produced a pair of genuinely lopsided Russian victories at Laga, and, several weeks later, At Kagul in the summer of 1770, battles in which Rumyantsev's considerably smaller Russian force routed Ottoman armies several times its own size through a combination of disciplined infantry tactics and considerably more effective artillery, victories that announced, to any European observer paying close attention, that the Russian army fighting under Catherine bore very little resemblance to the army that had nearly been destroyed on the banks of the Pruth 59 years earlier. At Kagul specifically, it is worth naming, Rumyantsev's own force of roughly 38,000 men faced an Ottoman army. Several surviving accounts place it well over 100,000, and one regardless, through a disciplined square formation that allowed Russian infantry to withstand repeated Ottoman cavalry charges from every direction at once. While Russian artillery, considerably better served and considerably more accurately aimed than its Ottoman counterpart, tore gaps in the attacking Ottoman ranks that the sheer weight of Ottoman numbers could never quite manage to close, a tactical lesson in the growing gap between Ottoman and Western European military technique that this same rivalry would go on demonstrating, in one form or another, across nearly every remaining battle this account still has left to describe tonight. It was at sea, however, that this war produced its single most spectacular and most genuinely astonishing episode. An episode this account intends to give the full attention it actually deserves, because the scale of the achievement involved is easy to underestimate at this historical distance. Catherine's government, recognising that Russia's own Baltic fleet, however impressive in home waters, had no realistic way of directly threatening Ottoman naval power in the Black Sea or the Eastern Mediterranean, made the genuinely audacious decision to send that same Baltic fleet on an extraordinary voyage, sailing out of the Baltic Sea, around the entire coastline of Western Europe, through the Strait of Gibraltar and into the Eastern Mediterranean itself, a journey of many thousands of miles undertaken by a fleet that had never operated so far from its own home waters, commanded nominally by Catherine's own favourite and close confidant Alexei Orlov, though the actual technical seamanship that made the voyage possible owed a great deal to foreign officers Catherine had specifically recruited into Russian service. Chief among them, a Scottish naval officer named Samuel Grieg, whose own considerable professional skill did much of the practical work Orlov's own aristocratic command could not have accomplished alone. That fleet finally caught the main Ottoman battle fleet at anchor in Chesma Bay, off the coast of Anatolia, in July of 1770, and what followed was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most complete naval victories of the entire 18th century. The Ottoman fleet, trapped in the confined waters of the bay, was first battered in open engagement, and then in a night attack using fire ships packed with combustible material and sent drifting deliberately into the tightly anchored Ottoman vessels, effectively annihilated. The great majority of the Ottoman battle fleet burned to the waterline or sunk outright in a matter of hours, a catastrophe from which the Ottoman navy would not fully recover for a generation, achieved by a Russian fleet that had, only a few years earlier, possessed no serious presence outside the Baltic at all. It is worth naming plainly exactly how disorienting this single battle must have felt to an Ottoman court that had spent nearly 3 centuries thinking of its own navy as one of the unquestioned instruments of imperial power in the Mediterranean world, to learn that a fleet belonging to the same northern neighbour, whose capital city had once burned so completely under Crimean Tatar torches 2 centuries earlier, had just sailed halfway around a continent to destroy that same navy at anchor, in what its own commanders had every reason to believe was safe and familiar water. Picture, for a moment, what that night attack must have actually looked like from the deck of one of those trapped Ottoman vessels, anchored close together in the confined waters of the bay, for what their own crews believed was mutual safety, when the first fire ship came drifting in out of the darkness already burning, its own abandoned crew having rowed clear only minutes before, and caught against the hull of an Ottoman ship of the line, the flames spreading in the crowded anchorage from vessel to vessel with a speed no crew could outrun, powder magazines detonating one after another through the small hours of the night. In a chain of explosions, foreign observers watching from several miles away described as lighting the entire horizon, until dawn broke over a bay that had held, the previous evening, one of the most powerful battle fleets in the eastern Mediterranean, and now held instead a surface of drifting wreckage and the bodies of several thousand Ottoman sailors who had never had any real chance to fight back at all. It is worth naming briefly what news of that single night actually did to opinion in the two capitals it concerned most directly. In St. Petersburg, when word of Chesma finally reached the court many weeks later, Catherine ordered a commemorative column raised in the gardens of Tsarskoye Selo and struck a medal bearing a single word, was, past tense, a deliberately blunt announcement that the Ottoman fleet, as a fighting force, simply no longer existed, while Alexei Orlov himself was granted the honorific surname Chesmensky to carry the victory permanently attached to his own family name. In Constantinople, by contrast, the news arrived as something considerably closer to genuine panic, the Sultan's own government initially struggling to establish how total the destruction had actually been, and ordinary residents of the capital, according to several foreign diplomatic accounts written from the city in the weeks that followed, growing visibly and audibly anxious at the prospect that a fleet capable of annihilating their own navy in the eastern Mediterranean might, in theory, appear off the very walls of Constantinople itself, an anxiety that proved, in the end, considerably larger than the actual Russian fleet's own remaining capability to act on, but one that reveals, plainly, exactly how deep a wound Chesma actually opened in the Ottoman Empire's own sense of its own naval invincibility. The Ottoman government responded, once the initial panic subsided, by launching a genuine program of naval rebuilding, recruiting European shipwrights of its own, in a belated echo of Peter's own grand embassy a century earlier, a reconstruction effort that would restore a functioning Ottoman battle fleet within a decade, though never again to a scale or a confidence capable of fully erasing the memory of the single night this account has just described. The war that Chesma and Kargul together decided so decisively in Russia's favour was finally settled by the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca, signed in 1774, and this account would ask you to pay particularly close attention to the terms of that treaty, because several of its clauses would go on to shape the entire remainder of the rivalry this whole night is tracing, in ways that reached far beyond the immediate territorial concessions the treaty actually extracted. Russia gained direct control of several key fortresses and ports along the northern coast of the Black Sea, along with, for the very first time, the right for Russian merchant ships to sail freely through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, the narrow straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, a right that would prove, across the following century and a half, to matter enormously to Russian strategic thinking. Just as significantly, the treaty declared the Crimean Khanate formally independent of Ottoman suzerainty, severing, on paper at least, the vassal relationship this account described at the very beginning of tonight's story. The same relationship that had once sent Crimean cavalry burning northward under Ottoman authority, though independence of this particular kind, as the following decade would make abundantly clear, was never intended by Catherine's own government to be a permanent arrangement so much as a convenient intermediate stage on the road to outright Russian annexation. It is worth naming, too, exactly how unusual this treaty struck contemporary European diplomats at the time, because negotiations of this kind between a Christian and a Muslim power had, for centuries, generally been conducted on terms that assumed at least the formal fiction of Ottoman superiority, and Küçük-Kaynarca instead produced a settlement negotiated, in significant part on Russian terms, a signal to every court in Europe that the balance of power between these two empires, which this account has already shown you running so overwhelmingly in the Ottoman direction for the first 2 centuries of this rivalry, had by 1774 tipped decisively, and, as the rest of tonight's account will go on to confirm, quite permanently the other way. And finally, buried within the treaty's own text, was a clause granting Russia the right to construct a church in Constantinople, and, in language that would prove far more consequential than its own original drafters likely intended, to make representations to the Ottoman government on behalf of that church's Orthodox Christian congregation, a modest and narrowly worded diplomatic provision that Russian statesmen across the following century would gradually stretch and reinterpret into something considerably grander, a self-proclaimed right to act as protector of every Orthodox Christian subject living anywhere within the Ottoman Empire's own vast territory. A claim that would, this account promises you now, and will show you in full detail later tonight, eventually help drag both empires into the single most devastating war either of them would ever fight against the other. It is worth pausing, before this account follows that claim any further, to name honestly what the Ottoman Empire's own actual treatment of its Christian and Jewish subjects had generally looked like across the centuries before Russia ever appointed itself their distant protector, because a fully fair accounting cannot let Russia's own self-proclaimed guardianship stand unquestioned as the only alternative to unrelieved persecution. The Ottoman state governed its own non-Muslim population through a system of semi-autonomous religious communities called millets, granting Orthodox Christians, Armenian Christians and Jews alike a considerable and genuinely real degree of internal self-governance over their own religious law, education and communal affairs in exchange for a special tax and a generally subordinate legal status, an arrangement that fell well short of anything resembling equal citizenship by any modern standard. But that also, and this account would ask you to hold both facts in mind at once, offered a degree of religious toleration considerably more consistent than much of contemporary Christian Europe, was itself extending to its own religious minorities during these same centuries, sheltering most famously tens of thousands of Jewish refugees expelled from Catholic Spain in 1492, who found, under Ottoman rule, a security and a communal continuity Western Christendom had specifically denied them. This account names the millet system here honestly, not to excuse the massacres and the unequal legal burdens this same system also permitted, and at times actively enabled, several of which tonight's account has already described and several more of which it still has left to describe. But because a rivalry this long deserves a portrait of both empires considerably more complicated than protector and persecutor, and because the real, lived experience of an ordinary Ottoman Christian across these centuries was very rarely as simple as either side's own later propaganda preferred to present it, it is worth naming too exactly what the special tax attached to that subordinate legal status actually meant for the ordinary Balkan Christian peasant who paid it year after year, generation after generation, because this account has already spent considerable time describing the 25-year conscription that funded Catherine's own wars, and honesty requires naming the parallel burden sitting on the other side of this same rivalry's ledger. The jizya, a poll tax levied specifically on non-Muslim subjects, together with a wider structure of Ottoman land taxation that fell, in practice, disproportionately on the peasantry regardless of faith, meant that the same wars this account has spent tonight describing as clashes of czars and sultans were, from the vantage point of an ordinary Bulgarian or Serbian or Greek farming family, first and foremost a matter of which army's tax collector would be knocking at the door of their own farmhouse in any given year, an ordinary and largely invisible burden that both empires extracted, in their own different ways, from precisely the same class of person neither empire ever thought to ask for its own opinion on the matter. A farmer whose own harvest, whichever side of whichever border he happened to live on in any given decade, was always somebody else's war chest before it was ever fully his own family's bread. It is worth naming, before this account follows Catherine to Crimea itself, exactly whose labour actually paid for the victories this long war produced, because the armies Rumyantsev led to Laga and Kargul, and the fleet that burned at Chesma were built, in the most literal sense, on the backs of a Russian peasantry conscripted for terms of service that could run, under the law as it then stood, for 25 years at a stretch, a length of service that meant, for the great majority of the ordinary soldiers who actually won this war, a near total severing from whatever family and whatever village had raised them, men who marched south as young conscripts, and who, if they survived at all, returned home, decades later, as strangers to villages that had long since given them up for dead. Catherine's own glory, and this account intends to remind you of it more than once across the rest of tonight, was purchased in a currency that never once appeared on any treaty's own printed page. Catherine did not wait long to finish the work Küçük Kenaka had only begun on paper. In 1783, less than a decade after the treaty's signing, Russian forces occupied the Crimean Peninsula outright, and Catherine formally annexed the territory, ending forever the independent existence of the Crimean Khanate and, with it, 3 centuries of the raiding economy this account described at the very start of tonight's story, the same slave-taking economy that had once carried untold thousands of Russian and Ukrainian captives southward into Ottoman markets. It is worth naming, honestly, what this annexation actually meant for the Crimean Tatar population that had called the peninsula home for centuries, because Catherine's own conquest did not simply transfer territory from one government to another, but set in motion a demographic transformation whose own human cost this account owes you plainly. In the years and decades following annexation, a very substantial proportion of Crimea's own Tatar population, driven by a combination of direct pressure from the new Russian administration, the loss of the Khanate's own protective institutions, and simple fear of what continued life under Christian rule might hold, emigrated southward into Ottoman territory, a population movement modern historians estimate may have carried away well over half of the peninsula's own pre-war Tatar inhabitants. Across the following century, land they left behind resettled, in significant part, by Russian, Ukrainian and German colonists. Catherine's government actively recruited to fill the resulting vacancy. This account would ask you to hold this quieter, less dramatic displacement in mind, alongside the far more violent expulsions this story will describe later tonight, because it establishes, this early in the rivalry's own long history, a pattern that would repeat itself in one form or another, again and again across the following century and a half, territory changing hands between these two empires, almost never without a corresponding change in exactly which ordinary people were permitted to go on living there. The architect of this annexation, and of the extraordinary programme of settlement and development that followed it, was a man whose own relationship with Catherine deserves a fuller portrait than the single clause mentions he usually receives in broader histories of this era. Grigory Potemkin, a former cavalry officer who had risen to become Catherine's own most trusted favourite, and, by the testimony of several contemporaries close to the court, quite possibly her own secret husband, a relationship the surviving evidence can neither fully confirm nor fully dismiss, and one this account will name honestly as genuinely uncertain, rather than pretending to a certainty the historical record does not actually support. It is worth naming before this count follows Potemkin to the cities he actually built, an even grander ambition he and Catherine shared privately across these same years, because the annexation of Crimea was never intended, in Catherine's own mind, to be the final word on this rivalry's oldest and most loaded prize. Catherine and Potemkin together developed, across the early 1780s, an ambitious diplomatic scheme historians now call the Greek Project, a plan to partition Ottoman territory in Europe outright between Russia and its Habsburg ally, restoring an independent Christian empire centred on Constantinople itself, and placing on its throne Catherine's own second grandson, a boy she had deliberately named Constantine, in explicit anticipation of exactly this ambition. Tutored from infancy in the Greek language by Greek instructors, Catherine personally selected a living, breathing piece of dynastic planning aimed squarely at the same Third Rome inheritance this account has already shown you Moscow claiming 3 centuries earlier. The Greek project never moved past the planning stage, undone by the practical difficulty of actually coordinating so ambitious a partition with an Austrian ally whose own enthusiasm for the scheme cooled considerably once the details were actually discussed. But it is worth naming here plainly, because it shows you, more clearly than perhaps any other single episode in this whole long rivalry, exactly how literally Russia's rulers were prepared to take the ideological inheritance this account has already described, not as poetic metaphor, but as an actual throne for an actual grandson, with an actual name chosen years in advance to fit it. Grand Duke Constantine himself grew up, this account would note, never actually sitting on the throne his own grandmother had once imagined for him in Constantinople, instead spending much of his adult life as a Russian military governor in Poland, a considerably more modest destiny than the one his own childhood tutors had been preparing him for, one further small and quietly poignant footnote to a rivalry that produced, across the whole of tonight's story, no shortage of grand imperial plans that never quite survived contact with the messier realities of actually executing them. Potemkin's own ambitions for the newly conquered territory he and Catherine together called New Russia were genuinely enormous, and it is worth being fair to him here, because the popular legend that has attached itself to his name across the centuries since has not always been especially fair. He founded new cities across the length of the northern Black Sea coast, among them Kherson, Ekaterinoslav, and, most consequentially of all for the rest of this story, Sevastopol, established specifically as the home port of an entirely new Black Sea fleet. Potemkin built essentially from nothing, a fleet that would, within a few short decades, become one of the central instruments of Russian power in exactly the maritime theatre where Peter the Great had once suffered such total and humiliating failure. When Catherine herself toured this newly settled territory in 1787, accompanied by an entourage of foreign dignitaries, Potemkin had specifically invited to witness the transformation with their own eyes. Later, largely hostile accounts of that journey claim that Potemkin had ordered hollow, painted facades constructed along the route to disguise the region's continuing poverty. Elaborate stage-set villages designed purely to deceive the Empress and her foreign guests into believing New Russia's development was considerably further along than it actually was, a legend that has given the English language the enduring phrase Potemkin village, still used today to describe any impressive but hollow facade built to conceal an unflattering truth. Picture for a moment what an ordinary settler arriving in this newly claimed territory in the 1780s would actually have found waiting there, because the reality, whatever the later Potemkin village legend claimed, was a genuine frontier in every sense of that word, wide open steppe grassland barely touched by permanent settlement, dotted with the first raw timber and stone foundations of towns that would not resemble anything like a finished city for another generation, a landscape of surveyors' stakes and half-dug foundations and immigrant families. Russian and Ukrainian serfs granted new land alongside Balkan Christian refugees, and even a scattering of invited German colonists, all of them building, quite literally from the bare ground upward, the settlements whose own names, Kherson, Odessa, Sevastopol, would within a single further century become synonymous with Russian power on the Black Sea, a transformation this account would ask you to picture not as some instantaneous act of a monarch's will, but as the accumulated, unglamorous labour of thousands of ordinary families whose own names, like so many others across the whole of tonight's story, did not survive into the historical record their own labour made possible. It is worth being honest here about how much of that famous legend modern historians have come to doubt, because a fully fair accounting of Potemkin's own achievement deserves better than a myth largely manufactured by his political rivals, both at the Russian court and among the foreign diplomatic community, several of whom had every personal and political incentive to diminish the achievements of a man who had, in a remarkably short span of years, transformed a recently conquered and sparsely populated frontier into a genuinely functioning network of cities, farms, and naval installations. The real story, most careful modern scholarship suggests, is considerably less dramatic and, in its own way, considerably more impressive than the hollow facade legend allows. Potemkin's new settlements were real, if still rough and unfinished in the way any newly founded frontier city inevitably is, and the achievement of populating and developing an entire region of this scale within the span of a single decade stands, on its own honest merits, as one of the more genuinely remarkable state-building projects of the entire 18th century, whatever the considerable exaggerations his own political enemies later chose to attach to it. Before this account follows that renewed war to its own considerably darker conclusions, it is worth pausing to properly introduce the general, whose own name will dominate the rest of tonight's account of it, Alexander Suvorov, a commander whose own personal habits struck nearly every contemporary who met him as genuinely eccentric, sleeping on straw alongside his own ordinary soldiers rather than in whatever comfortable quarters his rank entitled him to, learning the given names of common infantrymen under his command and greeting them personally by those names, and insisting, in a military culture that had rarely prioritised it, on proper food, proper boots, and proper medical care for the soldiers under him, a genuine and, by most contemporary accounts, genuinely sincere concern for ordinary welfare that sits. This account would ask you to notice and remember, in real and uncomfortable tension with the terrible violence his own campaigns would go on to produce. It was this same Suvorov who, only a few years before Ismail, had been dispatched not against any foreign enemy at all, but against a massive internal peasant uprising led by a Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev, a rebellion that had, at its own height in 1774, controlled a considerable stretch of Russian territory and drawn support from serfs, factory workers and other Cossack communities, animated by exactly the kind of grievance against Catherine's own government this account has already named tonight, and it was Suvorov's own effective and effectively merciless suppression of that rebellion that first marked him, in Catherine's own eyes, as a general capable of accomplishing whatever was asked of him without hesitation, a reputation that would carry him, only 16 years later, to the walls of Ismail. The Ottoman court, watching this rapid and deliberate transformation of what had, only a few years earlier, been an independent Muslim Khanate into a fortified Russian naval province, could not simply accept the loss of Crimea as final, and in 1787 the Sultan's government declared war once again, hoping to reverse Catherine's annexation before new Russia's development could fully solidify into something permanent, encouraged in this decision by British and French diplomats who, already wary of Russia's growing Black Sea power, quietly promised support that would, when the fighting actually began, prove considerably less substantial than the Ottoman government had been led to expect. This second Catherine-era war, fought across 1787 through 1792, produced some of the single bloodiest episodes in the entire history of the rivalry this account is tracing tonight, and a fully honest telling owes its listeners the full weight of that bloodshed, rather than a sanitized march from victory to victory. At the fortress of Ochakov, besieged across the brutal winter of 1788, Russian forces under a general named Grigory Potemkin himself finally stormed the walls in December of that year, and the storming was followed by a massacre of the fortress's own defenders and civilian population that contemporary accounts describe in genuinely harrowing terms. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers and Ochakov's own residents killed in the chaotic hours after the walls fell, a slaughter that shocked even several of the foreign officers serving in Russian ranks at the time, and one that this account will not soften simply because the war that produced it is, in most retellings, remembered primarily for Russian triumph. It is worth naming too, at least one ordinary voice from the other side of that same massacre, because a handful of surviving Ottoman garrison letters and later Ottoman chronicle accounts describe the desperate final days of Ochakov's own defence, with a clarity too rarely carried into Western retellings of this war. Defenders who had already endured months of winter bombardment with dwindling food and no realistic hope of relief, holding their own post anyway because the alternative, in a garrison culture that treated surrender as a disgrace, considerably worse than death, was simply not available to them. Ordinary soldiers whose own courage, in the final accounting, earned them nothing except inclusion among the thousands this account has already told you were killed in the hours after the walls finally gave way. It was during this same war that a Russian general whose own name would eventually become nearly synonymous with military genius, in Russian popular memory, first rose to true national prominence. Alexander Suvorov, a commander whose own tactical philosophy, built around speed, aggression, and a genuinely unusual personal care for the ordinary welfare of the soldiers under his command, had already been developing across earlier campaigns, but that reached its own most famous and most terrible expression at the fortress of Izmail in December of 1790. Izmail's own walls, by the time Suvorov's army arrived before them, had been reinforced with earthworks and artillery positions the Ottoman garrison's own commander had spent months improving, confident enough in the fortress's own strength that he reportedly told a Russian officer sent to demand surrender that the Danube itself would sooner flow backward than Izmail would fall, and Suvorov answered that confidence not with a prolonged siege, but with a single, meticulously rehearsed assault launched in the darkness before dawn on the 11th of December. Columns of Russian infantry scaling the walls under fire from every direction at once. Fighting, once inside, through streets and houses, the garrison's own defenders contested, room by room, for hours after the outer walls had already fallen. A battle that cost Suvorov's own army several thousand dead and wounded before the fortress's own resistance finally broke entirely. Izmail was, by the standards of contemporary fortification, an extraordinarily strong position, held by a garrison the Ottoman government had specifically reinforced and instructed to fight to the last man rather than surrender, and Suvorov's own storming of that fortress, launched before dawn on a bitterly cold morning after a considerably shorter siege than the fortress's own defences would ordinarily have required, succeeded within a matter of hours in a feat of arms contemporary European military observers considered nearly impossible. Suvorov himself, before ordering the assault, is said to have polled his own assembled officers on whether the attack could actually succeed, and to have proceeded only once, satisfied that his own subordinates shared his confidence. A small but telling detail about a commander whose own reputation for boldness never, by most surviving accounts, tipped over into genuine recklessness with his own soldiers' lives, whatever the terrible cost the city's own defenders and residents would go on to pay in the hours that followed. It is worth naming, honestly and without flinching, exactly what followed that victory, because Ismail's fall was accompanied by a massacre whose own scale ranks among the worst single atrocities either side committed anywhere across this entire 3.5-century rivalry. Russian soldiers, having taken the fortress at enormous cost to themselves, several thousand of their own comrades killed in the assault itself, turned on the surviving garrison and the civilian population sheltering inside the walls with a fury contemporary accounts describe as nearly uncontrollable, and modern historians' most careful estimates place the total number of Ottoman soldiers and civilians killed in the hours following Ismail's fall somewhere between 20 and 40,000 people. A single day's slaughter on a scale that would not be matched again in this rivalry's own long and bloody history for nearly another century. This account has already asked you, more than once tonight, to hold both hands open at once when weighing the ledger of this rivalry, celebrating genuine achievement while refusing to look away from genuine atrocity, and Ismail is exactly the kind of moment that demand is hardest and most necessary to actually honour, because Suvorov's own tactical brilliance and Russia's own genuine strategic achievement in taking a fortress European observers had considered nearly unassailable cannot honestly be separated from the tens of thousands of ordinary people, soldiers who had already effectively lost and civilians who had never fought at all, who were killed in the hours after that same brilliant assault succeeded. It is worth pausing here to add Ismail's own dead to a ledger this account has already been keeping across the whole of tonight, without ever quite naming it as a ledger. The thousands who burned in Moscow in 1571, the untold thousands carried south into slavery across 2.5 centuries of Crimean raiding, the soldiers who starved and thirsted to death on Munich's own steppe marches, and now the 20 to 40,000 who died at Ismail in a single terrible morning, a running total no single source has ever tried to add up in full, because no single source was ever positioned to see the whole of it at once, and it is precisely that fragmented, uncounted quality this account would suggest that has allowed a rivalry this genuinely catastrophic in its own total human cost to be remembered, in most popular retellings, as a sequence of individually thrilling military triumphs, rather than as the sustained, centuries-long catastrophe the actual numbers, however imprecisely we can reconstruct them, plainly show it to have been. The war finally ended with the Treaty of Jassy in 1792, a settlement that formally confirmed Russia's annexation of Crimea once and for all, and pushed the Russian imperial border further west to the Dniester River, cementing, in a way no earlier treaty in this long rivalry quite had, Russia's permanent transformation from a state once terrorised by Crimean raiders into the dominant power along the entire northern coast of the Black Sea. Potemkin himself did not live to see that treaty fully signed, dying only weeks before its completion in October of 1791, taken by a sudden fever while travelling back toward Jassy from the peace negotiations he himself had spent months personally overseeing, collapsing by several surviving accounts on the open steppe he had spent the better part of a decade transforming from empty grassland into the fortified naval province this account has already described, and dying there in the open air rather than any of the grand cities that still carried his own name and his own ambition, stamped across their own street plans, a genuinely fitting, if entirely unplanned, final resting place for a man whose whole adult life had been spent building something permanent out of exactly that kind of open, unclaimed ground. Catherine herself would die 4 years later in 1796, having presided across her own 34-year reign over one of the single most dramatic reversals of fortune either side of this rivalry ever experienced, taking a territory that had once been the base of operations for the very raids that burned Moscow to the ground in 1571 and transforming it, within the span of a single generation, into the home port of a Russian battle fleet. And it is worth pausing briefly on the genuine and considerable strangeness of that reversal before this account moves forward into the century that followed, because 225 years separated the burning of Moscow from Catherine's death, and in that span of time this same rivalry had turned itself almost completely inside out. It is worth naming too what became of Suvorov himself in the years after Ismail, because the general whose own name this account has attached to one of the single bloodiest atrocities of the entire rivalry did not, in the end, receive from his own government the uncomplicated gratitude his considerable service might seem to have earned him. Catherine's own son and successor, Paul I, a ruler whose own relationship with his mother's former favourites was, by nearly every surviving account, coloured by real and lasting resentment, dismissed Suvorov from active service only a few years into his own reign, and it was only the wider crisis of the Napoleonic Wars and a coalition of European powers specifically requesting Suvorov by name that returned the ageing general to command for one final, extraordinary campaign in 1799, leading a Russian army across the Alps into northern Italy and Switzerland in a mountain crossing contemporary military observers compared, without much exaggeration, to Hannibal's own ancient crossing of the same mountains, a campaign that added yet another layer of legend to Suvorov's own reputation, even as his relationship with his own Tsar continued to sour. Suvorov died in 1800, only months after returning from that campaign, reportedly out of favour at court and denied by Paul's own express instruction the full military honours his rank would ordinarily have commanded at his funeral, a quietly bitter final chapter for a commander whose own soldiers, by every surviving account, loved him more genuinely than almost any other general either empire produced across the whole of this long rivalry, and one more small human reminder that even this rivalry's own most celebrated victors rarely received, from the very governments they served, the uncomplicated gratitude their own service might seem to have earned them. It is worth pausing briefly on exactly who else happened to be sitting on a throne, or refusing to sit on one at all, during these same decades of Catherine's reign, because the comparison sharpens, by simple contrast, exactly how singular her own achievement in this rivalry actually was. Frederick II of Prussia spent these same decades building his own kingdom into a genuine European military power considerably smaller in territory than Catherine's Russia, but punching pound for pound well above its own weight. Louis XVI sat uneasily on the French throne through the final years of Catherine's own reign, watching a revolution build beneath him that would, within only 3 years of her own death, remove his head entirely, an outcome Catherine herself watched with genuine horror from St. Petersburg, tightening her own government's restrictions on any hint of revolutionary sentiment reaching Russian soil in direct response. And across the Atlantic, an American general named George Washington was, during these same Chesma and Kargil campaigns, leading a considerably smaller and considerably less resourced army in a revolution of his own, a war whose own eventual success Catherine's government watched with a kind of detached diplomatic curiosity, declining to directly involve Russia in a conflict so far removed from the Black Sea ambitions that consumed the greater part of her own attention. The decades immediately following Catherine's death brought a further war, fought between 1806 and 1812, against the backdrop of the wider Napoleonic conflict then consuming nearly the whole of Europe, a war whose own most consequential outcome was less any single battle than its own remarkably narrow timing. Napoleon himself, it is worth naming, had actively encouraged the Ottoman government to open this war in the first place, hoping a second front against Russia in the south would draw Russian attention and Russian troops away from the wider European struggle he was then waging against the Tsar's own government, a piece of grand strategic manipulation that succeeded for a time in tying down a considerable Russian army along the Danube for 6 full years, even as it ultimately failed to prevent that same army from arriving home in time to help meet Napoleon's own invasion the moment it actually came. The Treaty of Bucharest, which ended this war and confirmed Russian annexation of the territory of Bessarabia, was signed in May of 1812, a matter of mere weeks before Napoleon's own Grande Armée crossed into Russian territory in what would become the catastrophic French invasion of that same year, and it is worth naming plainly exactly how consequential that timing actually was, because had this Ottoman war dragged on even a few months longer, Russia would have found itself fighting a two-front conflict against Napoleon's own overwhelming force and the Ottoman Empire simultaneously, a strategic nightmare that Russian diplomats, working with real and considerable urgency in the treaty's final negotiations, managed to avoid by the narrowest of margins, freeing the Russian army that had spent 6 years fighting on the Danube to instead face Napoleon's invasion with its full strength intact. It is worth naming plainly exactly who negotiated that narrowly timed and genuinely consequential settlement, because the Russian general who signed the Treaty of Bucharest on his own government's behalf was Mikhail Kutuzov, the same general who, only a matter of months later, would take command of the Russian army defending against Napoleon's own invasion, meeting the Grande Armée at Borodino, and later presiding over the catastrophic French retreat from Moscow. A single career that carried one man, within the span of a single year, from negotiating peace with one empire this account has spent tonight describing to defending his own country against an entirely different and, for a brief and terrifying season, considerably more dangerous one. Kutuzov's own diplomatic skill at Bucharest, this account would note, drew on a career already deeply shaped by this same rivalry, since it was Kutuzov who had also served, decades earlier, as a young officer under Rumyantsev at Laga, and later commanded troops during Suvorov's own storming of Izmail, losing an eye to an Ottoman bullet along the way, so that the general who saved Russia from Napoleon had, in a very real sense, spent the whole of his own earlier career being formed by the very rivalry this account has walked you through tonight. The 8 years separating Napoleon's own final defeat at Waterloo in 1815 and the Greek uprising. This account is about to describe past, along this particular stretch of the rivalry's own long timeline, in genuine and relatively unusual quiet, the Congress of Vienna having reordered the wider European continent around a conservative principle of monarchical solidarity that briefly discouraged any of the great powers, Russia included, from disturbing the Ottoman Empire's own territorial integrity too aggressively, a quiet that would not, as this account is about to show you, last very long at all, once a genuinely popular uprising forced the question back onto every European court's own urgent attention. It was in the years following Napoleon's own final defeat that this rivalry entered a new and, in several ways, more morally complicated phase. One this account is going to walk you through in genuine depth, rather than passing over quickly, because the Greek uprising against Ottoman rule that began in 1821 placed the Russian government, then led by Tsar Alexander I, in a genuinely uncomfortable position, torn between its own long-cultivated identity as protector of Orthodox Christians everywhere within the Ottoman world, the very claim this account showed you being planted, almost as an afterthought, within the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca half a century earlier, and Alexander's own deep personal commitment, forged in the aftermath of Napoleon's revolutionary wars, to the principle that established monarchies should never openly support popular uprisings against any legitimate ruler, Christian or otherwise, for fear of the revolutionary contagion such support might eventually invite back onto Russian soil itself. Alexander himself, it's worth naming, had spent these same 8 quiet years growing increasingly mystical and increasingly conservative in his own private religious convictions, a marked change from the reform-minded young Tsar who had once discussed constitutional government with real seriousness earlier in his own reign, so that the ruler facing the Greek crisis in 1821 was, in significant temperamental respects, a considerably more cautious and considerably more religiously anxious man than the one who had marched into Paris in triumph only a handful of years earlier. Alexander's own hesitation meant that Russia, for the first several years of the Greek uprising, offered the rebels considerably less direct support than Greek nationalists had hoped for, watching from a careful diplomatic distance while Ottoman forces, and later a formidable Egyptian expeditionary army sent by the Sultan's own powerful vassal Muhammad Ali, worked to crush the revolt through methods that included massacres on islands like Chios that shocked public opinion across nearly the whole of Western Europe. It is worth naming, honestly, exactly how much personal anguish this hesitation seems to have cost Alexander himself, because several of his own courtiers left records describing a Tsar court in the final years of his own reign, between a foreign minister, an ethnic Greek statesman named Ioannis Kapodistrias, who would himself go on, within a few more years, to become independent Greece's own first head of state, urging active support for the Greek cause, and Alexander's own deep and by this point almost religious commitment to the principle of legitimate monarchical order, a commitment forged in the exhausting continent-wide struggle against Napoleon's revolutionary armies and formalised, only a few years earlier, in the Holy Alliance. Alexander had personally helped design, a private torment that historians still debate the full weight of, but one that meant thousands of Greek rebels fought and died across the early 1820s without the direct Russian intervention many of them had confidently expected, having placed their own hopes, not unreasonably given a century of precedent. This account has already walked you through tonight, in a northern protector who spent those same critical years choosing caution instead. It was only with Alexander's own death in 1825 and the accession of his younger brother Nicholas I that Russian policy toward the Greek question shifted decisively, because Nicholas, a considerably more assertive and considerably less philosophically conflicted ruler than his own predecessor, saw in the continuing Greek crisis both a genuine humanitarian cause, consistent with Russia's own long-standing Orthodox protector claim, and a genuinely valuable opportunity to extract further concessions from an Ottoman government that Nicholas, correctly as it turned out, judged to be entering a period of serious and possibly terminal weakness. It was under Nicholas's own more assertive direction that Russia joined Britain and France in October of 1827 in sending a combined naval squadron into Greek waters, ostensibly to enforce an armistice between the Greek rebels and their Ottoman Egyptian opponents. And it was that same combined squadron which, in the harbour of Navarino on the 20th of that month, engaged and virtually annihilated the Ottoman Egyptian battle fleet anchored there, in a battle that neither side, by most careful accounts, had actually intended to fight, but that ended, once fighting had genuinely begun, with the destruction of Ottoman and Egyptian naval power nearly as complete as the destruction Russia's own fleet had inflicted at Chesma 57 years earlier. A coincidence of scale this account finds genuinely worth naming. Two of the single most devastating defeats the Ottoman navy would ever suffer, separated by more than half a century, both delivered in significant part by Russian gunpowder and Russian seamanship. It is worth naming, too, exactly what condition the Ottoman military found itself in as this fourth Russo-Ottoman War approached, because the Sultan of the day, Mahmud II, had only the year before, in 1826, carried out one of the single most consequential internal reforms in the whole of late Ottoman history, ordering the destruction of the Janissary Corps, the once formidable infantry that had anchored Ottoman military power for centuries, but that had, by the early 19th century, degenerated into an unruly and frequently mutinous internal political force, considerably more dangerous to the Sultan's own throne than to any foreign enemy, an event Ottoman history remembers as the auspicious incident in which loyalist forces surrounded and massacred the rebelling Janissaries in their own Constantinople barracks, artillery loyal to Mahmud personally trained on the barracks the Janissaries had occupied in protest, and fired directly into the buildings, killing several thousand men in a matter of hours and burning the barracks themselves to the ground. An act of internal violence carried out by an Ottoman sultan against his own empire's own oldest military institution, on a scale that rivals, in its own single afternoon, several of the battlefield massacres this account has already described tonight as belonging to Russia's own side of the ledger. Mahmud's own reform was, in the long run, a genuinely necessary modernisation, but it left the Ottoman army that would face Diebitsch's advance only a few years later in a state of real and unfinished transition, still rebuilding an entirely new military structure to replace the one it had only just destroyed, a timing this account would ask you to hold in mind as at least part of the explanation for why Diebitsch's own crossing of the Balkans succeeded, where so many earlier northern armies had failed. It is worth naming, too, that Mahmud's own reforming instinct did not begin with him, and a fully honest accounting of the Ottoman Empire's own long 19th century struggle to modernise itself against exactly the kind of Russian pressure this account is describing tonight owes real credit to his own predecessor Selim III, who had attempted, across his own reign beginning in 1789, a considerably earlier and considerably more cautious programme of military and administrative reform, called in Ottoman Turkish the Nizami Sedid, the New Order, an attempt to build a modern European-style standing army alongside the older Janissary establishment, rather than replacing it outright. That caution proved, in the end, fatal to Selim personally rather than protective, because the Janissaries and their own conservative allies at court, threatened by reforms that undermined their own traditional privileges, rose in rebellion in 1807, deposed Selim, and, after a further palace intrigue the following year, had him killed, a fate that stands as a stark and sobering reminder of exactly how dangerous internal reform could be for an Ottoman ruler attempting it a full generation before Mahmud finally succeeded, by considerably more ruthless means, at the same basic task Selim had died, attempting to accomplish more gently. It is worth naming this quieter, earlier failure honestly, because it complicates any simple narrative of Ottoman decline as a story of stubborn refusal to modernise, when the real story, as so often across the whole of tonight's account, is considerably more tragic than that. A state whose own most capable reformers were, more than once across this long century, killed by the very institutions their reforms were meant to save. Selim's own Nizami Shedid regiments, small in number and starved of the resources and the political backing a genuinely serious reform would have required, were simply no match for the Janissaries' own entrenched power when the confrontation finally came, and it is worth remembering too that Selim himself was, by several surviving accounts, a genuinely talented composer and poet in his own right, corresponding warmly with foreign monarchs and reportedly composing music still performed in Turkey today, a gentler and more cultured temperament than the ruthless efficiency his own eventual successor Mahmud would need to actually finish the reforms Selim had begun and died for. It is worth naming briefly, too, exactly what kind of ruler Nicholas himself was at home, because the same Tsar who miscalculated so badly in his own reading of British and French intentions governed Russia across his own 30-year reign with a domestic severity that earned his era among later Russian historians the descriptive nickname the Nicholas system, a government built around rigid censorship, a secret political police force called the Third Section that monitored dissent with real and pervasive thoroughness, and a deep, almost instinctive suspicion of any idea, however modest, that smelled even faintly of the revolutionary sentiment that had convulsed Western Europe in Nicholas's own lifetime. It is worth naming too the particular and genuinely striking irony sitting at the centre of Nicholas's own foreign policy, because the same Tsar who positioned himself, across the whole of the Greek and Crimean crises this account has described tonight, as the self-appointed protector of oppressed Christian populations living under a foreign despot's rule, governed his own Christian Orthodox subjects at home with a domestic despotism of his own considerably more thorough in several respects than anything the Ottoman millet system this account has already described actually inflicted on its own non-Muslim population. It is worth naming, too, exactly how literal the sick man of Europe's own economic decline eventually became, because the phrase Nicholas coined was not merely a figure of speech, but a genuinely accurate diagnosis of a state sliding, across the second half of the 19th century, toward outright financial collapse. Decades of costly wars against Russia, the same rivalry's own wars, this account has spent tonight describing chief among them, combined with a pattern of borrowing from European banks on increasingly unfavourable terms to fund both those wars, and an ambitious but only partially completed programme of internal modernisation, left the Ottoman treasury so deeply indebted that in 1881 the empire's own European creditors imposed a supervisory body called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, staffed largely by British and French officials, with direct authority to collect and control a considerable share of the empire's own tax revenue in order to guarantee repayment, a genuinely humiliating arrangement that placed a meaningful portion of Ottoman state finance under direct foreign control for the remainder of the empire's own existence. One further concrete measure, alongside the territorial losses this account has already described in such detail, of exactly how far the sick man Nicholas once described had actually fallen by the century's own end. It is worth naming, too, that Russia's own state finances, while never subjected to quite so direct a foreign supervisory arrangement, carried their own heavy burden from this same accumulated century of warfare. The treasury forced repeatedly to borrow abroad, chiefly from French banks eager to cement a strategic alliance against a common German rival, to fund the very Black Sea fleet reconstructions and Balkan campaigns this account has described tonight, so that by the century's own end both empires found themselves financing their ancient rivalry with one another, in no small part through loans extended by exactly the same Western European powers that had spent the same century manoeuvring to limit whatever either side actually managed to win. Navarino, rather than settling the Greek question outright, instead led directly into a fourth and considerably more focused Russo-Ottoman War, declared by Nicholas in April of 1828, and fought with the explicit strategic aim, considerably more ambitious than any previous Russian war against the Ottomans had openly stated, of forcing the Sultan's own government to accept Greek autonomy, while extracting further Russian gains along the Black Sea coast in the process. The war's early campaigns, fought across 1828, went considerably less smoothly for Russian arms than Nicholas's own government had anticipated, a prolonged Russian siege of their Nubian fortress of Varna succeeding only after months of difficult fighting. But the campaign of 1829, commanded by a Russian field marshal named Ivan Dibich, achieved something no previous Russian army in this entire rivalry's long history had ever managed to accomplish, crossing the formidable natural barrier of the Balkan mountain range that had, for centuries, been considered by military strategists on both sides to be a nearly insurmountable obstacle to any northern army attempting to march directly on Constantinople. Dibich's army, having crossed those mountains through routes Ottoman commanders had genuinely believed impassable to a force of that size, advanced to the city of Adrianople, then serving as the effective gateway to Constantinople itself, a mere handful of days' march from the Ottoman capital and the Sultan's own government, facing the very real and immediate prospect of a Russian army appearing outside the walls of Constantinople for the first time in the entire history of this 3.5-century rivalry, chose to negotiate rather than risk that outcome. It is worth naming, honestly, what that crossing actually cost the ordinary soldiers who made it possible, because Dibich's own army, advancing through mountain terrain that had genuinely defeated every earlier northern invader, was reduced along the way by disease, exhaustion, and simple starvation to a fraction of the force that had originally set out, arriving at Adrianople itself so depleted that Dibich, by his own private admission to close subordinates, knew his own army could not actually have withstood a serious Ottoman counterattack had the Sultan's government simply understood how weak the force standing before its own gates had actually become. A bluff, in the most literal sense, that won an empire's own capital city's safety at the negotiating table, rather than through any real remaining Russian military strength. The resulting Treaty of Adrianople, signed in September of 1829, forced the Ottoman government to accept Greek autonomy, the essential first step toward the full Greek independence that would follow within a further 3 years, and granted Russia further territorial gains along the eastern coast of the Black Sea, including control of the mouth of the Danube, while also securing formal Ottoman recognition of autonomous status for the Danubian principalities and for Serbia, both placed, in the treaty's own language, under Russian protection, a diplomatic phrase that would, across the following decades, give Russian statesmen an enormous and repeatedly exercised pretext for further intervention in Ottoman internal affairs whenever it suited Russian strategic interest to invoke it. It is worth naming, honestly, exactly how Russian statesmen actually exercised that pretext across the following decades, because the autonomy granted to the Danubian principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia didn't simply free those territories from Ottoman interference only to leave them entirely alone. Russian consuls and Russian advisors installing themselves in the principalities' own internal administration with an intrusiveness several contemporary Romanian observers found scarcely less burdensome than direct Ottoman rule had been, a pattern this account would ask you to notice, because it recurs across nearly every single instance of Russian protection. This whole night describes a liberation from one overlord that so often arrived bundled together with the quiet imposition of another. Dibich himself, it is worth adding briefly, received for his own achievement the honorific surname Zabalkansky, meaning beyond the Balkans, granted by a grateful Tsar in direct recognition of the mountain crossing this account has already described, one further name added to a rivalry already thick with generals whose own family names were permanently altered by a single victory, Chesmensky before him and Zabalkansky now beside him, a small but telling detail about how completely this long argument had, by the early 19th century, become woven into the very identity Russian aristocratic families carried forward into the following generations. It is worth pausing here, roughly at the midpoint of tonight's long account, to name plainly the governing image this whole night has been quietly building toward, because the relationship between these two empires, across every single war this account has described so far and everyone it still has left to describe, has always turned in one way or another on a single physical place, a narrow, twisting channel of water connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, the straits the Ottomans called the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. Think of those straits as a door standing between two houses, a door the Ottoman Empire had held the only key to for nearly 4 centuries, opened and closed entirely at the Sultan's own discretion. And think of every war this account has described tonight, from Peter's failed campaign at Azov, to Catherine's triumph at Chesme, to Diebitsch's march on Adrianople, as an escalating, generations-long argument over who actually deserved to hold that key. An argument neither empire would ever fully win, and neither empire would ever fully abandon, right up until the moment, still many decades away from where tonight's story currently stands, when both empires finally lost the ability to argue over it at all. Picture, for a moment, an ordinary merchant captain standing on the deck of his own grain ship somewhere in the Black Sea, watching the low hills on either side of the Bosphorus close in around him as his vessel approached that narrow channel, knowing that whether his own cargo would be allowed to pass through to the markets of the wider Mediterranean depended in the end not on wind or current or his own considerable seamanship, but on the shifting and endlessly renegotiated politics of a rivalry between two empires. His own small ship had no part in creating a single, ordinary voyage standing in its own modest way for the whole of what this account is trying to describe tonight, an entire regional economy held hostage, generation after generation, to an argument fought mostly in treaty rooms an ordinary sailor would never once set foot inside. Russia's own influence over that door reached its single highest point only a few years after Adrianople, in 1833, when a temporarily desperate Ottoman government, facing a genuinely existential internal rebellion from its own overmighty Egyptian vassal Muhammad Ali, accepted Russian military assistance to help save the Sultan's own throne, assistance that came with a price attached in the form of the Treaty of Unkiar-Skelessi, a formal defensive alliance between the two former enemies that included, in a secret clause that scandalized the other great powers of Europe once its contents eventually became known, an Ottoman commitment to close the straits to foreign warships whenever Russia requested it, a provision that would, in effect, have turned the Black Sea into something very close to a private Russian lake, safe from any hostile foreign fleet for as long as the treaty remained in force. It is worth naming, honestly, how briefly that extraordinary arrangement actually lasted, because British and French diplomatic pressure, alarmed at the prospect of Russia gaining such total control over a strategic choke point of this importance, succeeded within less than a decade in reversing it. The London Straits Convention of 1841 replacing Unkiar-Skelessi's exclusive Russian arrangement with a considerably less favourable general principle, closing the straits to all foreign warships of every nation during peacetime, a formally neutral arrangement that nonetheless represented, from the Russian perspective, a real and stinging diplomatic defeat, the closest this rivalry's long argument over the straits had yet come to actually being settled, only to have that settlement immediately taken away again. It is worth naming, briefly, the specific Russian statesman who negotiated Unkiar-Skelessi, and who spent the better part of the following decade watching its own advantages slowly stripped away by British diplomacy, Count Karl Nesselrode, Nicholas's own long-serving foreign minister, a career diplomat of German Baltic origin, who had served Russia's own foreign policy establishment since the Napoleonic Wars, and who understood, better than almost anyone else at Nicholas's own court, exactly how fragile Russia's brief moment of exclusive influence over the Ottoman government actually was, a fragility his own Tsar, this account has already shown you, would go on to badly underestimate all over again 2 decades later in the very different and far more catastrophic crisis that finally produced the Crimean War. Nesselrode himself, it is worth adding, argued repeatedly and with real diplomatic caution against the more aggressive impulses of Nicholas's own foreign policy across the whole of his own long tenure, counsel that Nicholas increasingly disregarded as his own confidence in Russia's regional dominance grew, a pattern of an experienced advisor's caution being quietly overruled by a monarch's own accumulated overconfidence that this account would ask you to remember when the Seymour conversations this account has already described finally arrive. It was in the years that followed this reversal that Tsar Nicholas I, increasingly convinced of the Ottoman Empire's own approaching collapse, is remembered to have described the empire to a visiting British diplomat using a phrase that would go on to outlive nearly everything else about his own reign, calling the Ottoman state the sick man of Europe, a description that captured in a single memorable image both the genuine and accelerating internal weakness the Ottoman government was, in several real respects, actually experiencing during these decades, and the considerable danger inherent in any single European power, Russia very much included, assuming that weakness meant the Sultan's own remaining territory was simply there for the taking, a miscalculation Nicholas himself would, within only a few more years, come to regret in the most costly and humiliating way imaginable. It is worth naming in fuller and more precise detail than the famous phrase alone usually receives exactly what Nicholas actually told that British diplomat, a career ambassador named Sir Hamilton Seymour, across a series of remarkably candid private conversations held in St. Petersburg in January of 1853, because Nicholas did not merely offer a passing metaphor but proposed, in language Seymour dutifully recorded and forwarded to London, something considerably more concrete, a private understanding between Russia and Britain about how the Ottoman Empire's own territory might eventually be divided once its collapse, which Nicholas treated as a near certainty rather than a remote possibility, finally arrived. The British government's own considered response, delivered only after careful deliberation, was a firm and unambiguous refusal to participate in any such arrangement. A refusal Nicholas appears to have simply declined to take at face value, continuing to act, across the following months, as though British acquiescence in Russian ambitions toward Constantinople remained merely a matter of time and patient diplomacy, rather than a door that had already, quite clearly, been closed. It is worth sitting, honestly, with how much of the catastrophe that followed traces back to this single, very personal miscalculation. A Tsar so confident in his own reading of British intentions that he moved his own armies into the Danubian principalities without waiting to see whether that reading was actually correct, and it is worth naming too that this was far from the first time in this long rivalry that an individual ruler's own private conviction, formed in a closed room and never adequately tested against the wider diplomatic reality, had set in motion a war whose own eventual scale that same ruler had badly failed to anticipate, a pattern this account has already shown you once, on the banks of the Pruth in 1711, and will show you once more, in a considerably different and considerably more catastrophic form, when this same story finally reaches the summer of 1914. The spark that finally ignited that costly miscalculation arrived, as so many genuine catastrophes in this account's own broader accounting of history so often do, from a dispute that seems, at this historical distance, almost absurdly small measured against the war it eventually produced, a quarrel between French Catholic and Russian Orthodox clergy over which faith should hold custodial rights to a handful of Christian holy sites in Ottoman-controlled Jerusalem and Bethlehem, a dispute Nicholas chose to treat, in 1853, as a matter of genuine imperial principle rather than the relatively minor ecclesiastical squabble it might, under a different ruler or a different decade, have been allowed to remain. When Ottoman diplomacy, under pressure from a newly assertive French government led by Napoleon III, favoured the Catholic claim over the Orthodox one, Nicholas responded by demanding that the Sultan formally recognise Russia's own self-proclaimed protectorate over all Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, the same claim this account showed you germinating almost as a diplomatic afterthought within the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca 8 decades earlier, a demand the Ottoman government, backed now by both British and French diplomatic support, refused to grant, and Russian forces crossed into the Danubian principalities in the summer of 1853, beginning the sequence of events that would produce within a matter of months the single most consequential war in this rivalry's entire long history. The war's opening naval engagement, fought at Sinope on the Anatolian coast in November of 1853, produced a Russian victory of a completeness that should, by this point in tonight's account, feel genuinely familiar. A Russian Black Sea fleet under Admiral Pavel Nakhimov, a career officer already in his own late 50s by this point. A quiet and famously unpretentious commander who, like Suvorov before him, was known among his own sailors for sharing their food and their hardships, rather than standing apart from them, destroying an Ottoman naval squadron at anchor in a single devastating engagement. Nakhimov's own ships closed on the anchored Ottoman squadron through a driving rainstorm that had kept Ottoman lookouts from spotting the approaching Russian fleet until it was already within point-blank range, opening fire at a distance so close that entire Ottoman crews were killed at their own guns before they had managed to fire a second shot in return. The wooden Ottoman frigates catching fire one after another in the crowded anchorage in a scene several surviving accounts explicitly compared to Chesma itself, killing several thousand Ottoman sailors and effectively eliminating Ottoman naval power in the Black Sea in a single afternoon, an achievement that echoed, deliberately in the minds of several Russian officers present, the earlier triumphs at Chesma and Navarino. This account has already walked you through tonight. A third naval catastrophe inflicted on the Ottoman fleet within less than a century, and one that this time, unlike the two before it, would trigger consequences considerably larger and considerably less favourable to Russia than any of Nakhimov's own victorious sailors could have anticipated as they watched the Ottoman ships burn that November afternoon. It is worth naming, honestly, that Nicholas had been warned, repeatedly, and by his own most experienced diplomats, that British and French opinion would very likely read a war against the Ottoman Empire as a dangerous bid for outright Russian domination of the entire eastern Mediterranean, rather than as the narrow religious dispute Nicholas himself preferred to describe it as. Warnings Nicholas dismissed with a confidence historians have since judged, with the full benefit of hindsight, to have badly misjudged both the diplomatic mood in London and Paris, and the genuine alarm a single overwhelming naval victory like Sinope was almost certain to provoke in exactly those two capitals. But Sinope, rather than simply extending Russia's long pattern of naval dominance in this rivalry, instead produced an outcome none of those earlier victories had, because reports of the battle, framed in the British and French press as a massacre of helpless Ottoman sailors rather than a legitimate act of war, provoked exactly the kind of alarmed great power intervention Nicholas's own government had badly underestimated the likelihood of, and in March of 1854, Britain and France, genuinely alarmed at the prospect of unchecked Russian dominance over the Ottoman Empire and the strategic choke point of the Straits, this account has already described in such careful detail, declared war on Russia in support of the Sultan, transforming what had begun as the fifth major Russo-Ottoman war of this rivalry into a considerably larger and considerably more consequential conflict the world would come to remember simply as the Crimean War. It is worth pausing here on the deep and genuinely bitter irony embedded in that name, because the very peninsula Catherine had annexed with such triumphant confidence in 1783, the peninsula whose new naval base at Sevastopol Potemkin had built specifically to project untroubled Russian power across the Black Sea, became, 71 years later, the actual battlefield on which Russia's own imperial overreach would be most thoroughly and most publicly punished. Allied British, French, and Ottoman forces landed on the Crimean coast in September of 1854 and marched south towards Sevastopol itself, defeating a Russian defensive force at the River Alma along the way, a battle in which Allied infantry stormed heavily defended high ground overlooking the river, in a frontal assault that succeeded despite genuinely heavy losses on both sides. A Russian commander afterward reportedly stunned that the Allied army had not simply pressed on directly towards Sevastopol's own poorly defended northern approach in the immediate aftermath of that victory, a hesitation that gave Russian engineers, working under the direction of a talented military engineer named Edward Totleben, precious additional weeks to transform the city's own defences from a barely fortified port into the formidable earthwork bastion that would go on to resist siege for 11 further months, and by October of that same year, the Allied armies had begun what would become that same 11-month siege of the city. A siege whose own individual battles, fought at places like Balaclava and Inkerman, produced casualties on a scale that shocked even hardened contemporary observers accustomed to the considerable brutality of 19th century warfare. At Balaclava in October of 1854, a British cavalry charge launched against the wrong artillery position through a chain of miscommunicated orders rode directly into the mouths of Russian guns and was annihilated in a matter of minutes, an act of catastrophic and entirely avoidable courage that British poetry would go on to memorialise within weeks of the news reaching London, transforming a single afternoon's tactical blunder into one of the most enduringly remembered episodes of the entire war, a strange and telling reminder of how unevenly this rivalry's own long history has been remembered. A single doomed charge by 600 British horsemen recalled by an English-speaking world in far greater popular detail than the tens of thousands who had already died on both sides in the campaigns this account has spent the whole of tonight describing. It is worth naming too what became of the Russian admiral whose own victory at Sinope had opened this war, because Pavel Nakhimov, having taken personal command of Sevastopol's own defence once the siege began in earnest, remained inside the besieged city throughout, refusing by every surviving account to retreat to any safer position despite the constant bombardment, and was struck and killed by a sharpshooter's bullet while personally inspecting the city's own forward defences in June of 1855, only 3 months before the fortress he had spent the entire siege defending finally fell. As death his own soldiers mourned, contemporary accounts insist, with a grief considerably deeper than formal military protocol alone would have required. Nakhimov, in the end, did not live to see the war's own final humiliation, and neither, as it happens, did the Tsar whose own miscalculation had started it, because Nicholas I died in St. Petersburg in February of 1855, 7 months before Sevastopol's own fall, officially of pneumonia contracted while reviewing troops in bitterly cold weather, despite his own doctor's explicit warnings, though several contemporaries and more than one later historian have speculated, without ever managing to fully confirm it, that a Tsar who had watched his own carefully built system of European influence collapse so completely and so publicly across the preceding 2 years may have simply stopped taking the ordinary precautions that might have kept him alive. A rumour this account names honestly as unconfirmed speculation rather than established fact, but one worth naming regardless, because it captures something genuinely true about the scale of Nicholas's own personal defeat. A Tsar who had once dictated private diplomatic terms to a British ambassador with total confidence, dying only 2 years later, having lived just long enough to watch that same confidence proven catastrophically, publicly wrong. It's worth naming too exactly whose empire actually bore the heaviest share of the ordinary suffering inside this particular siege, because for all the attention this war's own British and French participation has received in the 2 centuries since, it was fought, on the Allied side no less than the Russian, in significant part by soldiers whose own governments treated their basic welfare as an afterthought. British soldiers in the trenches outside Sevastopol endured a winter in 1854 so poorly supplied that men froze to death in inadequate tents for want of the warm. It is worth naming plainly the ordinary human suffering this siege inflicted on soldiers of every nationality involved in it, because the Crimean War is remembered today, when it's remembered at all outside the specialist historical community, considerably less for its own strategic outcome than for the genuinely catastrophic failures of military medicine and military logistics it exposed on every side of the fighting. Failures a British nurse named Florence Nightingale would spend the remainder of her own long life working to correct, having witnessed firsthand at the military hospital in Scutari across the strait from Constantinople itself, conditions so squalid and so poorly managed that far more soldiers in this war would ultimately die of disease and infected wounds than of any bullet or artillery shell fired directly at them. A grim statistical pattern that held true across the Russian, British, French and Ottoman armies alike, and one that transformed Nightingale's own wartime experience into the foundation of modern professional nursing across the whole of the following century. There is one further, remarkably direct eyewitness to this same siege, whose own testimony deserves particular mention here, because it offers a window into the Russian experience of Sevastopol's own defence, considerably more intimate than any official military report could provide. A young Russian artillery officer serving inside the besieged city, who would go on, in the decades that followed, to become one of the single greatest novelists in the entire history of world literature, spent months of the siege itself keeping detailed observations of the ordinary soldiers and civilians enduring the constant bombardment around him. Observations he would later shape into a series of short sketches published under the collective title Sevastopol Sketches, work that presented the war with a moral honesty genuinely unusual for its own era, not as a stage for heroic glory, but as an experience of sustained, grinding, largely anonymous suffering borne overwhelmingly by ordinary conscripted soldiers who understood, in most cases, remarkably little about the grand strategic and diplomatic disputes that had actually put them inside a besieged fortress in the first place. That officer's name was Leo Tolstoy, and it is worth naming plainly, here, exactly what his own presence inside besieged Sevastopol represents for the honest ground-level accounting this account has tried to give you across the whole of tonight, a reminder that even the grandest and most consequential wars in this 3.5-century rivalry were fought, in the end, by individual young men who happened to be standing in a particular trench on a particular day, several of whom, like Tolstoy himself, survived to tell you, in their own words, exactly what that experience had actually cost them. Sevastopol finally fell to the Allied besiegers in September of 1855, after 11 months of siege that had, by the most careful modern estimates, killed somewhere in the range of 250,000 soldiers across every army involved in the fighting, Russian, British, French, and Ottoman together. A toll this account will not pretend to give you with any greater precision than the wide range the surviving evidence actually supports, and the war's final settlement, negotiated at the Treaty of Paris in 1856, delivered Russia the single most humiliating diplomatic defeat of the entire rivalry this account has traced tonight. The Black Sea itself was declared permanently neutralised, closed to warships of every nation including Russia's own, and Russia was specifically prohibited from maintaining any naval arsenal or fortification along its own Black Sea coastline, a provision that effectively dismantled, at a single diplomatic stroke, the entire maritime achievement Potemkin's fleet-building program had begun 3/4 of a century earlier, transforming Sevastopol, the city Tolstoy had watched burn and bleed for 11 straight months, into a demilitarized shell of the naval bastion it had once been intended to become. It is worth naming briefly exactly what the physical city itself looked like once the guns finally fell silent, because 11 months of continuous bombardment had reduced Sevastopol to a condition several foreign visitors who toured the ruins in the months afterwards struggled to describe in anything other than superlatives. Entire districts reduced to rubble, the great naval docks Potemkin's own program had built shattered beyond any immediate hope of repair, and a civilian population that had, by the siege's final months, been reduced to sheltering in cellars and improvised bunkers dug directly into the hillsides surrounding the harbour, a devastation so total that the city's own reconstruction, once the neutralisation clause was finally reversed in 1871, took decades rather than years to bring the port back to anything resembling its former strength. It would be, this account can tell you now, only 15 years before Russia found the diplomatic opportunity to reverse that particular humiliation, because the catastrophic French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871 removed, at a single stroke, one of the two great powers most invested in enforcing the Black Sea neutralisation the Treaty of Paris had imposed, and Russian diplomacy moved with real speed to exploit that opening, securing through the London Convention of 1871 formal international recognition of Russia's right to rebuild its own Black Sea fleet and fortifications, a genuine diplomatic triumph, achieved without firing a single shot, that restored to Russia the very capability the Crimean War's own catastrophic ending had stripped away, and one that stands as a useful, quietly instructive reminder that the long argument this account has spent tonight tracing was never settled permanently by any single treaty, however total that treaty's own terms might have seemed to the diplomats who signed it at the time. Before this account turns to the final great war this long rivalry would produce, it owes you honestly one further chapter of accumulated suffering this story has not yet named, a catastrophe considerably less famous than Sevastopol or Shesma, but arguably more devastating, in raw human terms, than either of them, and one that belongs squarely inside any fully honest accounting of what this rivalry actually cost the ordinary people, caught between its two great imperial houses. Across the years surrounding 1864, Russian forces completed a long and brutal campaign of conquest across the mountainous North Caucasus region, subjugating a collection of peoples the Russian state had spent decades trying and repeatedly failing to fully subdue, chief among them the Circassians, a Muslim population whose own homeland along the Black Sea's eastern coast Russian military planners had come to regard as an intolerable obstacle to the empire's own consolidated control of the entire Caucasian frontier. What followed the final Russian military victory in 1864 was not simple conquest, but something considerably closer to a deliberate campaign of ethnic removal, Russian authorities forcibly expelling the great majority of the surviving Circassian population from their own ancestral homeland, driving hundreds of thousands of people toward the Black Sea coast to be transported in overcrowded and poorly provisioned ships into exile within Ottoman territory, a forced migration that modern historians, drawing on the fragmentary but genuinely harrowing surviving evidence, estimate killed anywhere from several 100,000 to, by some considerably higher estimates, well over 1 million people, through starvation, disease and outright violence, both during the expulsion itself and in the desperately overcrowded and inadequately supplied refugee camps the Ottoman government, itself unprepared for a humanitarian catastrophe of this scale, struggled and frequently failed to adequately support once the survivors actually arrived on Ottoman shores. This account names the Circassian expulsion plainly and at real length here, rather than passing over it in a single sentence the way so many broad histories of this rivalry unfortunately do, because it stands, by any honest measure, among the single deadliest episodes of the entire 3.5-century conflict this whole night has been describing, a catastrophe inflicted not on rival soldiers meeting in open battle, but on an entire civilian population removed, in the most literal and devastating sense, from the only home its people had ever known, and because it is worth remembering, honestly, that the Ottoman Empire's own role in this particular tragedy, whatever its government's genuine failures in adequately caring for the refugees who arrived on its shores, was that of an overwhelmed receiving power rather than a perpetrator. One further reminder that the moral ledger this rivalry produced was never as simple as either side's own later national mythology would prefer to remember it. Picture, if you can bear to, the actual physical scene along that stretch of Black Sea coastline in the months this expulsion was carried out, because foreign observers and Russian officials alike left behind descriptions of beaches crowded with tens of thousands of Circassian families waiting, sometimes for weeks at a stretch, for a ship that could carry them south. Families who had already walked for days from mountain villages Russian forces had burned behind them, camped in the open with dwindling food and no real shelter. Watching children and elderly relatives die of exposure and disease before a single ship had even arrived to carry the survivors away. And then boarding vessels so overcrowded, so badly provisioned for a voyage of this length, that a considerable proportion of every single shipload, by several surviving foreign consular reports, did not survive to see the Ottoman coast at all, bodies committed to the same sea their own ancestors had lived beside for as long as anyone could remember. This account offers you that image plainly, not to dwell in horror for its own sake, but because a catastrophe this large deserves, at the very least, to be pictured rather than simply summarised in a single sentence of aggregated statistics. It is worth naming, too, what the survivors of that expulsion actually found waiting for them once their overcrowded ships finally reached Ottoman shores, because Ottoman coastal towns like Trabzon and Samsun, never prepared to absorb a refugee population of this scale, arriving within the space of a few short years, saw disease spread through the packed and inadequately supplied arrival camps with a speed that killed a further and largely uncounted number of Circassian survivors before they had even managed to resettle anywhere at all, families who had already lost their own homeland arriving, in an almost unbearable final irony, into a second catastrophe considerably less dramatic than the expulsion itself, but, for the individual families it killed, every bit as final. The descendants of those who did survive resettlement went on, across the following decades, to establish communities scattered across the Ottoman Empire's own remaining territory, from the Balkans to the Levant, a diaspora whose own modern descendants still, to this day, mark the anniversary of that 1864 expulsion as a defining catastrophe in their own people's history, a piece of this rivalry's own long ledger that receives, even now, considerably less recognition than it honestly deserves. The final great war this long rivalry would produce grew, in the end, out of exactly the kind of pan-Slavic and pan-Orthodox sentiment this account has already shown you germinating in earlier decades. Sentiment that reached a genuine fever pitch across Russian society in 1876, when reports began reaching Russian newspapers of the brutal Ottoman suppression of an uprising among the Christian Slavic population of Bulgaria, a suppression carried out in significant part by irregular Ottoman militia forces, whose own conduct, once reported in vivid and genuinely horrifying detail by Western journalists, and repeated to enormous political effect in a widely read pamphlet by the prominent British statesman William Gladstone, produced a wave of public outrage across Russia and much of Western Europe that the Tsar of the day, Alexander II, found himself under enormous domestic political pressure to answer with something considerably more decisive than diplomatic protest alone. It is worth naming, honestly and without flinching, what that suppression actually involved, because the single incident that did more than any other to carry this uprising's own true character to a horrified European public occurred in a small Bulgarian town called Batak, where irregular Ottoman militia forces, responding to a local rebellion that had already largely collapsed by the time they arrived, killed, by the most careful modern estimates, somewhere in the range of 5,000 of the town's own residents, men, women and children alike, in a matter of days, leaving bodies unburied in the town's own streets and inside its own church for weeks afterward, a scene later described in person by Western journalists and diplomats who travelled to the site specifically to verify reports they had, at first assumed must be exaggerated, only to find the actual devastation considerably worse than the rumours had suggested. The Ottoman government of the day, it is worth naming honestly, had relied on exactly this kind of irregular militia, drawn largely from local Muslim communities and only loosely under regular military discipline, specifically because the empire's own regular army was already stretched thin defending other frontiers, a decision that saved the imperial treasury considerable expense, while producing exactly the kind of atrocity that would, within a matter of months, help cost the empire far more territory than any regular garrison could ever have been blamed for losing. It is worth naming, plainly, the American journalist whose own reporting did more than perhaps any single other source to actually carry the scale of that suppression to a Western audience, otherwise inclined to see the Ottoman Empire as a useful strategic counterweight to Russian ambition. Januarius Magehan, an Ohio-born correspondent already respected for his earlier reporting on the Franco-Prussian War, who travelled personally through the burned Bulgarian villages in the summer of 1876, and filed dispatches describing scenes of massacre so detailed and so carefully documented that they proved considerably harder for sceptical British readers to dismiss than second-hand rumour alone might have been, dispatches that, combined with a widely circulated pamphlet by the prominent British statesman William Gladstone, shifted British public opinion just enough that the British government, which might otherwise have moved quickly to support the Ottoman Empire the way it had during the Crimean War 2 decades earlier, hesitated long enough for Alexander's own government to act without the immediate threat of British intervention this same rivalry had produced so decisively in 1854. It is worth naming, too, a further and genuinely striking irony sitting underneath Alexander's own decision to go to war in defence of oppressed Balkan Christians, because this was the very same Tsar who, only 16 years earlier, in 1861, had signed the Emancipation Manifesto, finally freeing Russia's own serfs from the bondage this account has already described Catherine's reign tightening rather than loosening. A reformer Tsar leading his own newly freed peasantry, many of them barely a decade removed from their own legal bondage, south into a war fought in the name of freeing someone else's oppressed subjects. It is worth naming, too, that Alexander II's own reforming instincts, whatever their genuine and considerable merit, did not ultimately protect him from the very forces his own emancipation had helped unleash, because a Tsar who had freed 40 million serfs and fought a war explicitly framed as liberation was assassinated in St. Petersburg in 1881 by revolutionaries who judged his own reforms nowhere near radical enough, killed by a bomb thrown at his own carriage only hours after he had reportedly approved. That same morning, a further and more sweeping proposal for constitutional reform, a final and genuinely bitter irony. This account names here because it fits, all too neatly, into the same pattern of reform meeting violent resistance. This account has already shown you claiming Selim the third 3/4 of a century earlier, on the opposite side of this same long rivalry. Alexander declared war in April of 1877, and the campaign that followed, fought across the Balkans and simultaneously across the Caucasus frontier, produced at the fortress town of Plevna in northern Bulgaria one of the single most stubborn and most costly defensive stands either side of this entire rivalry ever mounted. An Ottoman commander named Osman Pasha, holding Plevna with a garrison considerably smaller than the besieging Russian and allied Romanian forces surrounding him, resisted repeated and increasingly costly Russian assaults for 5 full months across the summer and autumn of 1877, inflicting casualties on the besieging army so severe that Plevna's defence came to be regarded, even by Russia's own eventual victors, as one of the genuinely impressive feats of arms in the whole war, and it is worth naming Osman Pasha's own considerable skill and considerable courage here plainly, because the fully honest, both hands are counting. This account has promised you, across the whole of tonight, applies just as fully to Ottoman commanders as it does to Russian ones, and Plevna's defenders, whatever the war's eventual outcome, fought with a discipline and a resolve that deserves to be remembered on its own terms, rather than simply as an obstacle Russian arms eventually overcame. Osman Pasha's own defensive innovation, a dense network of earthwork redoubts and interlocking trench lines, built with real engineering skill on the high ground surrounding the town, repelled 3 separate major Russian assaults across July and September of 1877 alone. Assaults that cost the besieging army tens of thousands of casualties in attacks contemporary military observers from across Europe travelled specifically to Plevna to study. A single Ottoman garrison stand influencing, in its own quiet way, the development of trench warfare doctrine that European armies would draw on again, on a far larger scale, only a few decades later. Plevna finally fell in December of 1877, its own garrison, reduced by months of siege and starvation to a fraction of its original strength, attempting a desperate breakout that failed, and Osman Pasha himself was taken prisoner, treated in a detail worth naming honestly, with genuine and considerable respect by his own Russian captors, who recognised in his defence of Plevna a feat of military skill worth honouring even in defeat. Osman Pasha's own sword returned to him personally by the Russian commander who accepted his surrender, a small gesture of soldierly respect between two professional enemies that stands in real and deliberate contrast to so much of the atrocity this account has spent tonight otherwise describing. With Plevna's fall, the road south lay open, and Russian forces, in a further echo of Diebitsch's own achievement half a century earlier, crossed the Balkan mountains in the depths of winter, fighting a series of desperate engagements at the Shipka Pass along the way against Ottoman forces attempting, at enormous cost to themselves in the brutal mountain cold, to hold the same passes Diebitsch's army had once forced open in 1829, and by the end of January in 1878, Russian forces had advanced to San Stefano, a small town within sight of Constantinople itself, closer to the Ottoman capital than any Russian army in the entire history of this rivalry had ever previously come. It is worth naming too the particular and genuinely brutal character of the fighting at Shipka Pass itself, defended across weeks of freezing mountain weather by a mixed Russian and Bulgarian volunteer force holding a position so exposed that soldiers on both sides died of simple frostbite in numbers that, on the worst days, rivaled combat casualties outright. A Bulgarian volunteer later recalling, in a memoir historians still draw on today, that the defenders sometimes ran so short of ammunition during the heaviest Ottoman assaults that they resorted to hurling the frozen bodies of their own dead comrades down onto the attackers climbing the slope below, a detail this account offers you not for its own shock value, but because it captures, more honestly than any grander strategic summary could, exactly what holding a mountain pass in the depths of a Balkan winter actually demanded of the ordinary men who did it. General Fyodor Radetzky, the Russian commander responsible for holding Shipka across the whole of that brutal winter, would later be honoured with monuments across Bulgaria itself, a foreign general remembered in a country not his own, with a warmth that speaks to exactly how deeply this single mountain pass came to be woven into Bulgarian national memory of its own path to independence, a memory that, this account would note, still shapes the warm and unusually durable friendship between the Bulgarian and Russian peoples that persists in some real form even now, more than a century after the guns above Shipka finally fell silent. The Treaty of San Stefano, signed in the town in March of 1878, delivered Russia and its Balkan allies a settlement of genuinely sweeping scope, creating a large autonomous Bulgarian state extending across a considerable stretch of Ottoman Balkan territory, recognising full independence for Serbia, Romania and Montenegro, and granting Russia further territorial gains in the Caucasus, terms so favourable to Russian and Slavic interest that the other great powers of Europe, above all Britain and Austria-Hungary, refused to accept them, alarmed at the prospect of a large new Russian client state controlling territory reaching nearly to the shores of the Aegean Sea itself. It was the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck presenting himself, in a phrase that has echoed down through diplomatic history ever since, as an honest broker with no direct interest of his own in the outcome, who convened the Congress of Berlin later that same year to renegotiate San Stefano's terms, and the settlement that emerged from that Congress, while still confirming full independence for Serbia, Romania and Montenegro, and granting Russia its Caucasian territorial gains, dramatically reduced the size of the new Bulgarian state, and returned considerable Balkan territory to direct Ottoman control. A diplomatic reversal that struck Russian public opinion, which had followed the war's own considerable Russian sacrifices with genuine and sustained emotional investment, as a bitter and largely unjust betrayal of victories won at enormous human cost on the actual battlefield. It is worth naming honestly exactly how self-interested Bismarck's own honest broker posture actually was, because Germany itself had no direct territorial stake in the Balkans, but had every interest in preventing the wider European war that unchecked Russian gains might otherwise have triggered between Russia and Austria-Hungary, two powers Bismarck's own alliance system depended on keeping, however uneasily, on speaking terms with one another, a calculation of pure great power self-interest dressed up, at the Congress itself, in the more flattering language of impartial European statesmanship, and one more small reminder that the fate of this rivalry's own outcomes was decided, again and again across the whole of tonight's story, by powers whose own interests very rarely aligned with the interests of the ordinary Balkan Christians and ordinary Ottoman subjects those same outcomes were nominally being decided on behalf of. It is worth naming too the considerably less discussed human cost this same settlement produced on the opposite side of the rivalry's own ledger, because the creation of an autonomous Bulgaria and the reduction of Ottoman territory across the Balkans triggered in turn a mass displacement of the region's own Muslim population. Hundreds of thousands of Ottoman Muslims, ethnic Turks and Bosnian and Balkan Muslims alike, fleeing or forcibly expelled southward into what remained of Ottoman territory in a movement history remembers by the Ottoman Turkish word muhacir, refugees, a displacement whose own scale and whose own suffering this account would remind you mirrors, in a genuinely uncomfortable and rarely acknowledged symmetry, the Circassian expulsion. This account has already described tonight running in the opposite direction, only 14 years earlier, two population movements, separated by little more than a decade, in which each empire's own territorial gain was purchased, in significant part through the displacement of whichever civilian population happened to be standing on the wrong side of the newly drawn border. Many of these Balkan Muslim refugees, in a final and genuinely striking closing of the circle, this account has already shown you opening, were resettled by the Ottoman government in precisely the same Anatolian coastal regions that had, only a decade and a half earlier, absorbed the surviving Circassian refugees this account has already described. Two displaced peoples from opposite ends of this rivalry's own long geography, thrown together into the same overstretched provinces by the same underlying imperial collapse. It is worth naming, honestly, exactly how enormous that human cost actually was, because the War of 1877 and 1878, fought across barely 10 months, killed, by the most careful modern estimates, well over 100,000 Russian soldiers alone, a toll that fell, as it so often did across every single war this account has described tonight, disproportionately on ordinary conscripted peasants drawn from villages whose own names would never appear in any treaty or any diplomatic communique. Young men who marched south across the same Balkan passes Diebitsch's army had once crossed, fought and froze and starved, through a winter campaign fought largely for reasons of pan-Slavic sentiment and great power prestige, that most of them, like Tolstoy's own Sevastopol conscripts a generation earlier, almost certainly understood only in the barest and most fragmentary outline, and whose own individual names and individual deaths this account would remind you here, as it has reminded you at several points across tonight's long account, were never counted with anything approaching the same careful attention history has given to the generals and the Tsars who sent them south in the first place. Before this account leaps forward to the final war this rivalry would produce, it owes you a brief accounting of the roughly 3.5 decades separating the Congress of Berlin from the outbreak of the wider European war in 1914, because a great deal changed inside the Ottoman Empire across those years that shaped exactly how its final confrontation with Russia would eventually unfold. The Sultan, who came to the throne only 2 years before the 1877 war even began, Abdulhamid II, responded to the humiliation of Berlin and to the accumulating pressure of pan-Slavic sentiment this account has already described by cultivating a rival ideology of his own, pan-Islamism, positioning himself, in his own capacity as caliph, as the protector and unifying figure for Muslim populations scattered across the globe, a direct mirror, this account would ask you to notice, of the very same pan-Slavic and pan-Orthodox protector claim Russia had been building since Küçük Kaynarca more than a century earlier, two empires each reaching, in the end, for the same basic strategy of transnational religious solidarity to shore up an authority neither could any longer fully guarantee through military strength alone. Abdulhamid's own reign grew, across its final decade, increasingly autocratic and increasingly repressive, and it was during these same years, in 1894 through 1896, that Ottoman forces and irregular auxiliaries carried out a wave of massacres against the empire's own Armenian population, killing, by most modern estimates, somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 people. A precursor, this account names plainly and with real discomfort, to the far larger catastrophe of 1915, this account has already described in full, carried out under circumstances of considerably less wartime chaos and considerably less excuse. Abdulhamid's own increasingly autocratic rule was finally ended in 1908 by the Young Turk Revolution, a movement of reform-minded military officers and civil servants who forced the restoration of a constitutional government and, within a few further years, effectively seized direct control of the state themselves. Enver Pasha, the same officer this account has already shown you, leading the catastrophic Sarıkamış offensive, rising through this same movement from a junior officer to one of the three most powerful men in the empire. It was under this same Young Turk government that the Ottoman Empire suffered its own final and most humiliating territorial losses before the wider World War even began, the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, in which Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, the very states this account has already shown you gaining their own independence or autonomy across a full century of Russian-assisted wars against the Ottoman Empire, allied together and drove Ottoman forces almost entirely out of Europe in a matter of months, a defeat considerably more total than anything even the Congress of Berlin had inflicted, leaving the Ottoman Empire, by the time the wider war finally arrived in 1914, an empire that had already lost nearly the whole of the European territory. This entire long rivalry had originally been fought over, entering its final war against Russia not as a still formidable rival, but as a state already reduced, in significant and lasting part by the accumulated consequences of this very rivalry, to a fraction of its own former self. It is worth naming, too, that the Balkan Wars produced their own considerable civilian suffering on every side involved, hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees fleeing the newly expanded Balkan Christian states, in a further wave of the same displacement this account has already shown you, following nearly every single territorial change this rivalry ever produced, one final grim confirmation, only months before the wider World War began, that the pattern established at Crimea in 1783 had never actually stopped repeating itself. This account owes you, before it turns toward the final chapter of this long rivalry, a brief and honest accounting of how the historical record you have been listening to tonight was actually assembled, because the surviving sources on both sides of this 3.5-century argument carry their own considerable biases worth naming plainly rather than passing over in silence. Much of the earliest Western scholarship on this rivalry was written by British and French historians, whose own countries had, for most of the 19th century, treated Russian expansion toward the Straits as a direct strategic threat to their own imperial interest in India and the Eastern Mediterranean, a perspective that shaped, often quite explicitly, which Russian actions those historians chose to portray as naked aggression, and which comparable Ottoman actions they chose to treat with considerably more sympathy. Russian and Soviet-era historians, working from the opposite direction, frequently framed this same long conflict as an unbroken narrative of righteous liberation. Orthodox Christian populations freed one war at a time from Ottoman oppression, a framing that, whatever genuine truth it captures about the real suffering of Balkan Christians under Ottoman rule, tends to minimize or simply omit the considerable violence Russian expansion itself inflicted on Muslim populations like the Circassians this account has already described tonight. Ottoman and, later, Turkish historians, for their own part, have often approached this same long rivalry as an extended narrative of territorial loss and civilizational retreat, a framing this account has tried, across the whole of tonight, to complicate by giving full and honest weight to moments of genuine Ottoman military skill and genuine Ottoman resilience. From the defenders of Plevna to the failed but genuinely audacious Ottoman Crimean campaign against Astrakhan, this story described near its very beginning. It is worth naming too a handful of the specific individual sources this account has leaned on tonight to try to correct for exactly those competing biases, because the British historian Orlando Figes, writing in the early 21st century, produced one of the more genuinely balanced modern accounts of the Crimean War specifically, drawing with equal care on Russian, British, French and Ottoman archival material in a way earlier, more nationally partisan historians rarely managed. Tolstoy's own Sevastopol sketches, already named earlier tonight, remain an irreplaceable ground-level Russian source precisely because they were written from inside the siege itself, rather than reconstructed afterward from official reports, and on the Ottoman side, diplomatic correspondence and memoirs of statesmen like Ahmed Cevdet Pasha. Already the subject of considerable modern scholarly attention for his detailed chronicling of Ottoman decline across this same century, offer a vantage point too rarely translated into the Western languages most popular retellings of this rivalry are actually written in. It is worth naming too a body of evidence considerably less formal than any of these written histories, because the ordinary people who actually fought and suffered through this rivalry left behind their own record of it in oral tradition long before any professional historian thought to write their experience down. Russian folk epics called Bailini preserved, across generations of oral transmission, half-legendary memories of frontier warfare against steppe raiders stretching back centuries before Peter or Catherine ever reigned. Cossack communities sang narrative ballads called dummy that carried in verse form the specific memory of sieges and captivities, much like the Azov sitting this account has already described, and Bulgarian and Balkan Christian communities preserved, in their own oral songs and laments, memories of Ottoman rule and Ottoman reprisal that official Ottoman records naturally had very little interest in recording from that same angle. This account has tried tonight to draw on the more formal written record wherever that record exists, but it is worth naming honestly that a great deal of what ordinary people on every side of this rivalry actually felt survives, if it survives at all, only in exactly this kind of half-remembered, half-embellished song, passed down by people who had no reason to expect a historian, 3 centuries later, would ever come looking for it. The final chapter of this long rivalry arrived, in the end, not through any deliberate choice by either empire's own government so much as through the accumulated momentum of decades of accumulated grievance, finally colliding with the wider catastrophe of a world war. Neither empire had any realistic hope of surviving intact. When the general European war broke out in the summer of 1914, the Ottoman government, led in practice by a triumvirate of ministers, among whom a soldier named Enver Pasha held particular influence over military policy, initially declared neutrality, but Enver's own long-standing personal admiration for German military power, combined with a genuine and deeply rooted Ottoman fear of exactly the kind of Russian territorial ambition this whole account has spent tonight describing, tilted Ottoman policy steadily toward the German side of the widening conflict. That tilt became irreversible in October of 1914, when 2 German warships that had been formally transferred to Ottoman Naval Command sailed into the Black Sea and bombarded Russian ports along the Crimean and Caucasian coast without any formal declaration of war, an unauthorized act by their own German commanding admiral that nonetheless dragged the Ottoman Empire within days into open war against Russia, reopening one final time the same Black Sea battlefield this account has described being fought over, in one form or another, for 3.5 centuries. It is worth naming Constantinople once the scale of the disaster became unmistakable, leaving subordinate officers to manage the catastrophic retreat, and to explain, as best they could, how so ambitious a plan had produced so complete a ruin. It is worth naming too that Russian forces facing this offensive were themselves considerably smaller in number, and only barely held their own defensive positions long enough for the Ottoman attackers to be defeated, as much by their own government's catastrophic planning as by any decisive Russian counterattack, a defeat whose own scale and whose own consequences, this account would ask you to hold honestly in mind, contributed directly to the atmosphere of panic and paranoia inside the Ottoman government that would, within only a few further months, help produce one of the single greatest atrocities of the entire war, the mass killing and deportation of the Ottoman Empire's own Armenian population, a catastrophe this account names here honestly and without euphemism, because a fully truthful accounting of where this long rivalry's own accumulated fear and paranoia ultimately led cannot, in good conscience, leave out the ordinary Armenian families who paid in 1915 for a war between two empires whose own long and bitter history had nothing originally to do with them at all. It is worth naming, plainly, and at somewhat greater length than a single passing sentence can honestly carry, exactly what that catastrophe actually involved, because the scale of it demands considerably more than a euphemism. Beginning in April of 1915, the Ottoman government ordered the arrest and execution of hundreds of Armenian community leaders and intellectuals in Constantinople itself, and in the months that followed extended a policy of mass deportation across the whole of the empire's own Armenian population, forcing hundreds of thousands of men, women and children on death marches south through the Syrian desert, toward camps that had, in most cases, no genuine capacity to house, feed, or shelter the numbers arriving at them, a campaign of killing and deliberate starvation that modern historians estimate killed somewhere between 600,000 and 1.5 million people. A range this account will not pretend to narrow further than the genuinely contested evidence allows, but one whose lower bound alone represents a catastrophe of almost incomprehensible scale. It is worth naming, too, that the very word historians and international law now used to describe a crime of exactly this kind. Genocide was coined only decades later in the 1940s by a Polish Jewish legal scholar named Raphael Lemkin, who cited the mass killing of Armenians explicitly. Alongside the Holocaust, his own family had survived, as one of the defining atrocities that made a new legal category necessary in the first place, a linguistic legacy this account would ask you to sit with honestly, that an event unfolding at the ragged, fear-soaked edge of this 3.5-century rivalry helped give the modern world the very language it still uses today to name humanity's own worst crimes. This account has named, across the whole of tonight, the Ottoman raiders who burned Moscow, the Russian soldiers who massacred Ismail, the Russian state that expelled the Circassians, and the Ottoman irregulars who burned Bulgarian villages, and it names the Armenian catastrophe here with the same plain honesty, not because it settles any argument about which empire this rivalry ought to condemn more thoroughly, but because a story that has spent all night insisting on counting the uncounted dead cannot, at its very end, look away from the largest and least excusable of all of them. It is worth naming, before this account follows both empires to their own final collapse, exactly how long the argument over the straits this whole night has kept returning to actually manage to outlive the two empires that fought over it. Because the question of who controls passage through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles was not finally settled by the collapse of either the Russian or the Ottoman imperial house at all, but by an entirely separate international agreement, the Montreux Convention, signed in 1936 by the new Turkish Republic, and a gathering of other interested powers including the Soviet Union, the very state that had, by then, replaced the empire whose own czars had fought over that same passage for 3.5 centuries. A convention that still governs, in its own broad outlines, who may sail a warship through that narrow channel today, nearly a century after it was first signed, one final, quietly persistent reminder that some arguments outlast every single empire that ever fought to win them. Both empires, in the end, did not survive the war that this final chapter had helped ignite, and it is worth naming plainly, exactly, how close together their own final collapses actually arrived. Because a rivalry this account has spent the whole of tonight tracing across 3.5 centuries ended, in the most literal sense, with both of its own original participants disappearing from the world within a span of scarcely more than 5 years of one another. The Russian Empire collapsed first, the Tsar Nicholas II forced to abdicate in the revolutionary upheaval of March 1917, and the entire Romanov dynasty, the same dynasty this account showed you stabilizing after the time of troubles 3 centuries earlier, murdered outright by Bolshevik captors in a cellar in the city of Ekaterinburg in July of 1918. The Ottoman Empire followed only a few years behind, defeated alongside its own German and Austro-Hungarian allies in the wider war, its own government forced to sign the humiliating armistice of Mudros in October of 1918, and the Sultanate itself, the same office that had once commanded Devletgiri's cavalry to burn Moscow to the ground in 1571, formally and permanently abolished by the new Turkish national government in 1922, replaced the following year by a modern secular republic under a general named Mustafa Kemal, who would take for himself and for the new state he had built from the empire's own ashes the honorific surname Ataturk, father of the Turks, a new republic built quite deliberately on the explicit rejection of nearly everything the fallen empire this whole long night has described had once stood for. It is worth naming too one final and genuinely painful echo of this whole rivalry that arrived only a generation after both empires had already fallen, because in May of 1944, the Soviet government that had by then replaced the Russian Empire, this account has spent tonight describing, carried out the mass deportation of the entire remaining Crimean Tatar population, the same people this account has already told you were driven to emigrate southward in such large numbers after Catherine's own annexation a century and a half earlier, loaded onto freight trains within a matter of days on the accusation of collective wartime collaboration with Nazi Germany, and transported thousands of miles to Central Asia in conditions that killed, by some modern estimates, close to half of the deportees within the first 18 months alone through starvation, disease, and simple exhaustion. This account names it here, at the very end of tonight's long story, because it is a genuinely uncomfortable but genuinely necessary reminder that the patterns this whole rivalry established, land taken and repopulated, whole peoples moved by force because of who they were, rather than anything they had individually done, did not simply end when the Tsars and the Sultans who first established them finally disappeared from the world, but continued to echo in one form or another for decades after both of the empires that first practiced them were already gone. It is worth sitting, honestly, with the genuine strangeness of that near-simultaneous ending, because two houses that had spent 3.5 centuries locked in the same accumulated argument, an argument that had burned Moscow and annihilated fleets at Chesma and Navarino and Sinope, that had killed hundreds of thousands of Circassians and tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers at Ismail, and well over 100,000 Russian soldiers in the Balkan snow of 1877, that had built and demolished and rebuilt Sevastopol's own fortifications no fewer than 3 separate times across barely a century and a half, did not, in the end, defeat one another so completely that only one house was left standing to claim final victory over the argument itself. Instead, both houses fell within a handful of years of each other, victims in the end less of one another's own accumulated blows than of a wider 20th century catastrophe that neither imperial system, built as both were on centuries-old foundations of dynastic rule and rigid hierarchy, ultimately proved capable of surviving, an ending that this account would ask you to sit with honestly, rather than reading as any kind of tidy moral conclusion, because there is no clean lesson waiting at the bottom of a rivalry this long and this bloody, only the plain, sobering fact that neither side actually won it. In any way, either side's own most confident generals or most ambitious Tsars and Sultans would have recognised as victory. Think for a moment about how many ordinary people this single long argument between two great imperial houses actually passed through and consumed along the way, across 3.5 centuries of it. The baker's wife this account opened with tonight, asleep in a wooden house that would not exist by the following week. The untold and largely uncounted thousands carried south into slavery from Russian and Ukrainian villages, across 2.5 centuries of Crimean raiding. The soldiers who froze and starved on the banks of the Pruth in 1711 and who bled at Ismail in 1790 and who watched Tolstoy write down their own suffering inside besieged Sevastopol in 1855. The Circassian families driven from mountain homes their own ancestors had held for centuries. The peasant conscripts who crossed the Balkan snow in 1877 for reasons of pan-Slavic sentiment, most of them barely understood. The Armenian families who paid in the terrible winter of Sarakamish's own aftermath for a catastrophe that had begun 3.5 centuries earlier with a Crimean Khan's cavalry burning a wooden city neither Armenians nor Circassians nor Bulgarians had ever had any part in. This whole long night has tried, at every single one of these moments, to slow down just long enough to let you actually see the individual human costs sitting underneath the grand, sweeping narrative of empires rising and falling, because that individual cost, this account believes, is where the real and lasting truth of any long historical rivalry actually lives, considerably more than in the names of the treaties or the dates of the battles that a shorter, tidier telling might have been satisfied to simply list for you instead. Let us walk back, one final time, through the whole shape of the argument this long night has tried to trace for you, because the distance covered across 3.5 centuries is genuinely enormous. There was a burning city in 1571 and a Crimean Khan riding under Ottoman authority who could not have imagined, in his own moment of total triumph, that his own vassal Khanate would not exist at all within 212 years. There was a young Tsar who built a fleet with his own hands and lost it again on the banks of the Pruth, and a German-born empress who took that same fleet's unfinished ambition and turned it within a single reign into a genuine and lasting mastery of the Black Sea. There was a fortress at Ismail, where victory and atrocity arrived in the very same terrible hours, and a naval battle at Chesma so total that an empire which had ruled the eastern Mediterranean for 3 centuries watched its own fleet burn to the waterline in a single night. There was a Straits question that Russia won and then lost and then won again. An entire century's worth of European great power diplomacy organised around a single narrow channel of water neither empire would ever fully control. There was a war fought over a quarrel about church keys in Jerusalem that killed 250,000 soldiers outside the very fortress Catherine's own favourite had built to project untroubled Russian power across the Black Sea, and there was a Circassian population driven from its own ancestral homeland in numbers this account could not even give you with any real precision, whose own suffering belongs inside this story, exactly as fully as any generals or any czars. And there was, at the very end of all of it, 2 dynasties, one that had ruled for 300 years and one that had ruled for 600, both of them falling within a handful of years of each other, not because either finally defeated the other, but because the whole world both of them had spent 3.5 centuries fighting over had simply and permanently moved on without them. You have heard, across these many hours, about a baker's wife asleep in a city that would not survive the week, and about a Crimean Khan who could not have imagined, in the completeness of his own triumph, that his own descendants would one day be driven from that same peninsula in their turn. You have heard about a Tsar who laboured with his own hands in a foreign shipyard, and lost everything he built there on the banks of a river in Moldavia, and about the empress who came after him, and finally turned that failure into a fleet that circled half of Europe to burn its own enemy's navy to the waterline in a single night. You have heard about Suvorov, beloved by his own soldiers and abandoned in the end by his own Tsar, and about Nakhimov, who would not leave the city he was defending even when leaving it might have saved his own life. You have heard about a slave trade that carried away captives by the untold thousands, and about a Circassian people driven from their own mountains in numbers this account could never fully give you, and about a Crimean Tatar people driven from their own peninsula not once but twice, 1.5 centuries apart by 2 different empires that shared, whatever else divided them, the exact same willingness to move an entire people off its own land whenever that land was needed for someone else. You have heard, too, about a Straits question fought over for 1.5 centuries by diplomats who mostly never set foot on the water they were arguing about, and about a secret wartime promise that offered Russia, at the very last possible moment, everything its own Tsars had wanted since 1571. Only to be published to the world by the very revolution that ended the empire that had signed it. You have heard about Batak and about Ismail, and about the deserts south of Sivas and Erzurum where Armenian families walked until they could not walk any further. And you have heard, this account hopes, that none of these names are being offered to you tonight as a scorecard, some tally kept to decide which empire behaved more cruelly than the other across 3.5 centuries of fighting, because that is not the reckoning this whole long night has actually been trying to make. What this account has tried to do across every single hour of tonight is show you that a rivalry this old and this famous is never, in the end, simply the story of two crowned heads and their armies, but the story of everyone standing in the space between them, the baker's wife and the Don Cossack and the Bulgarian villager, and the Armenian mother and the Circassian family and the ordinary Russian conscript, none of whom chose this argument, all of whom paid for it anyway. Both hands held open at once, one final time, because this whole long night has insisted on it at every single turn, and should not abandon that insistence now, right at the very end, simply because the story is nearly finished and sleep is close. In one hand, an Ottoman Empire that raided Russian villages for captives across 2.5 centuries, that burned Moscow to the ground, that massacred Bulgarian villagers at Batak and Armenian families by the hundreds of thousands in the desert, and that also, in the very same centuries, sheltered Jewish refugees no Christian kingdom in Europe would take in, held its own vast and staggeringly diverse empire together through genuine periods of real and functioning tolerance, and produced, at Plevna and at Ismail, and in the frozen passes above Shipka, soldiers whose own courage this account has tried all night to name honestly rather than erase simply because they were fighting on the losing side of history's eventual verdict. In the other hand, a Russian empire that freed itself from centuries of tribute and slave raiding through genuine and hard-won struggle, that broke the back of the Crimean slave trade once and for all, that gave the world Chesma and Sinope, and a young artillery officer inside besieged Sevastopol who chose to write the truth of ordinary suffering instead of comfortable glory, and that also expelled the Circassians, deported the Crimean Tatars not once but twice, tightened its own peasantry's bondage even while presenting itself to Voltaire as the very picture of enlightened reason, and governed its own subjects across long stretches of this rivalry, with a domestic severity that makes its own claim to be liberating anyone else's subjects considerably harder to take entirely at face value. Both of these accountings are true at once, and holding them both in mind together, this account has believed across the whole of tonight, honours the actual human beings who lived and fought and died on every single side of this argument considerably more than any tidier, one-sided version of this story ever could. Neither hand cancels the other out, neither hand was ever meant to, because that was never the point of holding them up together in the first place. If you tried, tonight, to add up every single number this account has given you across the whole of this long story, the untold thousands burned or enslaved at Moscow and across 2.5 centuries of Crimean raiding, the tens of thousands lost at Ismail in a single terrible morning, the 250,000 who died around Sevastopol, the hundreds of thousands, and quite possibly well over 1 million, Circassians killed or displaced in a single decade, the 100,000 Russian soldiers who died in the Balkan snow of 1877, and the hundreds of thousands to well over 1 million Armenians killed in 1915, you would arrive, this account believes, at a total cost somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 million lives, a figure so large that this account has deliberately avoided stating it outright until this very last moment, because a number that size read aloud on its own tends to stop meaning anything at all, and this whole long night has been built instead on the belief that the only way to actually feel the true weight of a rivalry this vast is to walk through it, name by name, village by village, and war by war, the way this account has tried to walk you through it, across every single hour of tonight, one name, one village, one terrible morning at a time. There is a particular kind of quiet worth sitting with, here, near the very end of a story this long and this heavy, because the temptation, at the close of any account this dense with battles and treaties and accumulated human suffering, is to reach for some clean and comforting lesson, some tidy summary that makes all of it feel, in retrospect, as though it followed some sensible and inevitable design. This account is not going to offer you that comfort, because it would not be honest to offer it. What actually happened between these two empires across 3.5 centuries was not a single, coherent story marching toward any particular ending, but a long accumulation of individually reasonable decisions. A Tsar protecting his southern frontier, a sultan defending a vassal khanate, an empress annexing a peninsula her own predecessor had once been humiliated trying to hold, a pan-Slavic public demanding their own government answer reports of atrocity with something more than diplomatic protest, each decision reasonable enough on its own terms, and each one adding layer upon layer across 3.5 centuries to a rivalry that neither side, at any single point along its own long length, could have simply chosen to end. Think, too, for just a moment, before this account finally releases you into whatever sleep is already gathering at the edges of tonight, about how many other families this same enormous grinding rivalry actually passed through, quietly, far from any battlefield this account has named. If your own family traces its own roots anywhere near the lands this story is spent tonight describing, the Black Sea steppe, the Balkans, the Caucasus, the villages that once stood in the path of a Tatar raid, or a Russian conscription officer, or an Ottoman tax collector, there is a real and genuine chance that some ancestor of yours, several generations back, lived through some fragment of the very story this account has just told you. A birth and a marriage and a death recorded, if they were recorded at all, in a single sparse line in some register nobody thought to keep more carefully. A person who feared a raid or buried a son taken by conscription, or walked south as a refugee from a mountain village, whose own actual voice and whose own actual face are gone now in exactly the same way the baker's wife. This account opened with "Tonight is gone," not maliciously erased, simply never recorded by people who had no way of knowing the recording would ever matter to anyone. This account cannot give you that ancestor back, whoever they were, any more than it could give back the baker's wife it opened with tonight. But it can offer you the same small comfort it hopes it has offered this whole long rivalry, across the whole of tonight, that the not knowing is not nothing, and that naming a silence honestly, once out loud, is itself a real and meaningful form of care. And yet, whatever else this long and heavy night has asked you to carry, it is worth remembering gently as this account finally begins to let you go, that both of these houses, for all their own accumulated cruelty toward one another and toward the ordinary people caught between them, also produced across the very same 3.5 centuries genuine moments of individual courage worth remembering on their own terms. A Cossack band holding a fortress for 5 years with no support from anyone, an Ottoman commander defending Plevna against overwhelming odds with a skill his own enemies openly admired, a young artillery officer inside besieged Sevastopol who chose, in the middle of a war built on national pride, to write down the truth of ordinary suffering instead, a truth that would eventually help shape one of the great humane literatures of the following century. Whatever this rivalry cost, and this account has tried all night to be honest about exactly how much it actually cost, it did not manage to extinguish every single ordinary act of courage or ordinary act of decency that occurred somewhere inside it, and that too deserves to be remembered here, at the very end, alongside everything else, one final small candle held up against 3.5 centuries of a much larger, much colder, and much more patient darkness. Before you finally let go completely tonight, remember once more that a like and a subscribe would help this small channel take one more real step toward the 10,000 subscribers we are still steadily working our way toward. And if you are watching this on YouTube, the newest episodes of this channel actually go up early over on Spotify for creators, with the link waiting patiently in the description below. While if you found your way here tonight from Spotify instead, we would genuinely love it if you searched Historian at Midnight on YouTube and subscribe there as well, helping this same small channel grow on both sides of its own house at once. And if you feel like it, before your eyes finally close for good, leave your city and your local time down in the comments so that somewhere else out there, in some other quiet room on this same turning planet, another tired listener can know they were not the only one drifting off tonight to the sound of two old, exhausted empires finally laying their long argument down. Close your eyes now, gently, if they are not closed already, and let this long, patient 3.5-century-old story finally fully rest. Let the baker's wife this account opened with tonight rest too. Her own name lost to history, but her own fear, this account hopes, at least honestly remembered once more, gently before the night finally takes it. Let Sevastopol's own rebuilt walls stand quiet now, and let the straits between two seas run dark and undisturbed beneath a sky neither empire ever fully owned, exactly the way they have run every single night for longer than either empire that once fought so hard over them ever managed to survive. Whatever is pressing on you tonight, whatever old argument feels, right now, too large and too heavy and too old to ever be set down, it too is smaller, in the end, than the argument this whole long night has just finished tracing for you. And even that one, given centuries enough and patience enough, finally, quietly, came to rest. Thank you, as always, sincerely and gratefully, for spending these slow, unhurried hours here with me tonight. For as long as your own eyes actually manage to stay open, good night, sleep well, rest easy, and sweet dreams, wherever in the world you happen to be listening from tonight.